He didn't knock. Silas Rowan kicked the front door open like he owned the place, like he'd always owned it. And the first thing out of his mouth wasn't a greeting. It was a name, spat like a curse across the yard so every man on that ranch could hear it. Maris Rowan is a thief. 6 cowboys froze where they stood. The ranch owner stepped off the porch. And the woman standing in the kitchen doorway, flowers still on her hands, a cracked wooden spoon at her side, felt her blood run cold in a way she hadn't felt since the night her husband died. And she discovered there was nothing left. Not a cent. Not a chair. Not a single person willing to look her in the eye. She had survived that. Barely. And now this man, this smiling, well-dressed snake who had wept at the funeral and stolen from the estate before the body was cold, was standing in the one place she had finally, cautiously begun to call safe. If you've ever had someone try to take the only good thing you've managed to hold on to, you already know what came next. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started, and I promise you, it does not end the way Silas Rowan planned. If this kind of story speaks to something in you, please subscribe and follow along to the end. I share stories like this every week, and I never want you to miss one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Maris Rowan arrived at Iron Bluff Ranch, she had 30 cents in her coat pocket, a split seam along the left shoulder of her dress that she'd sewn shut 3 times already, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from a long string of them stretching back further than she cared to count. She had walked the last 2 miles. The man who'd given her a ride in his wagon had turned east at the crossroads, and she hadn't wanted to ask him to go out of his way. She didn't ask people for things anymore. She had learned, over the past 8 months, that asking made you look weak, and looking weak made people feel like they had permission to say no loudly and with an audience. So she walked. The road into Iron Bluff was rutted and dry, and by the time the main house came into view through the scrub brush, her left boot had rubbed a raw spot along her heel that she could feel with every step. She stopped walking for a moment and looked at the place. It was bigger than she'd expected. That was the first thing she noticed. 2 stories, with a wide front porch that needed paint, and a barn off to the east that looked like it had been well built once. The fencing was decent. The yard was not. Tools left out. A wagon with a broken wheel sitting just past the barn with no indication anyone had plans to fix it. A water trough with a crack running along one side, patched with what looked like river clay that had long since dried and begun to crumble again. The place wasn't falling apart, but it was tired. She recognized that feeling. She took a breath and kept walking. The front door was answered by a man who was not Garrick Hale. He was older, with a gray beard that looked like it had decided its own shape years ago and never been corrected since, and he looked at Maris the way people sometimes look at something they're not sure they ordered. "You the cook?" he said. "I am," she said, because it was true, because she needed it to be true, and because there was absolutely no version of this morning where she was going to turn around and walk back down that rutted road. The man? She'd later learn his name was Dutch, though nobody seemed to know if that was his first name or his last, stepped back and let her in without another word. He pointed down the hall toward the kitchen and then disappeared through a side door like a man who had already used up his daily allotment of hospitality. She found the kitchen on her own, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment without moving. The stove was cold, not just unlit, cold in the way that says it hasn't been used in days. The ashes in the firebox had gone gray and fine, the kind of ash that's had time to settle and stop smelling like anything at all. The counter held a tin of something that turned out to be salt when she opened it, and beside it, a small ceramic canister with maybe 1.5 cups of flour at the bottom, which she only discovered by reaching in with her hand because the canister was too tall to see into easily. There was a single iron pan hanging from a hook on the wall. 1 pan for a crew of 6. She opened the pantry. Bare shelves, a few empty hooks, a smell of old grease and maybe onions from a season ago. She stood there and looked at those shelves for a long time. 8 months ago, she would have cried. 6 months ago, she might have sat down on the floor and let herself feel how unfair everything was for a little while. But this was now. And now she was standing in a strange kitchen with 30 cents to her name and a job she had agreed to do. And at some point between then and now, she had used up whatever portion of herself went in for crying. She turned around and started opening every door and drawer she could find. This was something she had developed, not a talent exactly, more like a habit born from necessity. She called it nothing. She just did it. Started in the most obvious places and worked outward, opening things people forgot about, checking corners, getting down on her knees and looking under shelves. People who kept kitchens always stashed things in odd places. Backup supplies, forgotten stores, things that got pushed to the back and then a new thing got put in front, and eventually nobody remembered what was behind it. The first thing she found was a quarter barrel of salted pork tucked in the back corner of the lean-to off the kitchen, behind a stack of empty feed sacks. The lid had been weighted down with a rock, which was probably the only reason the pork hadn't been discovered by something with 4 legs. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. It wasn't much, but it was something. She kept looking. In the cellar, a low, dark space under a trapdoor in the kitchen floor that she found by pulling back a braided rug, she discovered a crate of potatoes that had been down there long enough to start sprouting. Not rotten, just adventurous. She'd cooked with worse. Under the cellar stairs, she found a tin of lard that was maybe 2/3 full and smelled fine when she opened it. And behind the lard, wrapped in a burlap sack and tied with twine, a bundle of dried apples that crackled when she pressed them, but were still whole. Back upstairs, in the very back of the highest shelf in the pantry, she found something that made her stop and close her eyes for just a second. 6 eggs, sitting in a shallow bowl, covered with a cloth. Someone had put them there carefully, deliberately. She didn't know if they'd been forgotten or saved, but they were not cracked, and they were not bad. 6 eggs. She did the math fast. 6 men coming back before dark. She had no idea when, but ranch hands came back hungry, regardless of when. And there was no version of this evening where she was going to stand at the door and tell 6 tired, hungry men that she had nothing ready because the pantry was bare and nobody had warned her. Not on her first day. Not ever, if she could help it. She set the eggs on the counter, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. The first problem was the stove. She wasn't afraid of a cold stove. A cold stove was just a stove that didn't know it was supposed to be warm yet. But she needed wood, and she needed it split fine enough to catch fast. She went back out through the lean-to and found the wood pile around the side of the house, and she found the splitting axe leaned up against the wall near it. She didn't know how to split wood the way a man who'd done it for years could do it. The clean, efficient swing from the shoulder that quartered around in one motion. Her way was less elegant. She swung too high and sometimes too hard, and occasionally entirely missed what she was aiming at. She split the wood anyway. It took twice as long as it should have. When she carried the first armload back inside, Dutch was standing in the kitchen doorway with his coffee cup, watching her. "You need help?" he said. "No," she said, which was not entirely true, but close enough. He nodded and moved out of her way. The stove came up slowly. She was patient with it, the way you have to be patient with something that's been left alone too long. Coaxing rather than forcing, small pieces before big ones, letting the heat build rather than smothering it. By the time the fire had settled into something reliable, she had already started on the pork. Salted pork required soaking to pull the salt back, and she didn't have time for a proper soak, so she did what her mother had shown her when she was young enough that the stove edge was still at her eye level. She sliced it thin, almost paper thin, and worked it in cold water twice, changing the water between, pressing it gently between her palms each time. It wouldn't be perfect. She knew that. It would still carry more salt than a proper cook would put in deliberately, but it would be edible, and beyond that, if she handled the rest of the dish carefully, the extra salt might actually help. The potatoes took the most time. She cut out the eyes, peeled them as fast as she could, put them in a pot of water to sit while she dealt with the pork. The lard went into the pan and she let it come up slowly. She diced half the pork small and left the other half in strips. The small pieces would go into the potatoes. The strips she'd cook separately and serve alongside for the men who wanted more. The dried apples she set to simmering with a small amount of water and the last of the sugar she'd found in a small paper twist at the back of the flour canister. Barely 2 tablespoons, but enough. The apples would cook down into something soft and sweet, and after a meal made from salt and roots and old pork, something sweet had a way of making men feel they'd been fed well. She had learned that too. The flour she used last. She didn't have nearly enough for proper biscuits, not for 6 men, so she made flatbread instead. Mixed the flour with a pinch of salt, a little lard worked in cold, enough water to bring it together. It wasn't going to be beautiful, it wasn't going to be light, but it would be warm, and it would be bread, and bread had a way of filling a space at the table that nothing else quite managed. She was rolling the first of the flatbreads when she heard boots on the porch. Not one set, several. The low rumble of men who were tired and not bothering to be quiet about it. Her hands went still on the dough for exactly 1 second. Then she kept rolling. The door opened and Dutch's voice came through from the entry, talking to someone. She heard a lower voice respond, short, clipped, not particularly warm, and then footsteps coming down the hall, and then Garrick Hale was standing in her kitchen doorway. She had been told the name of the ranch owner. She had not been told anything else about him, and so the man she had imagined, older, soft around the middle, the kind of man who let a house get tired while he sat on the porch, bore very little resemblance to the one now looking at her. I was not old. Maybe late 30s. Lean the way men got lean when they worked hard and ate when they could, and didn't think about it too much in between. His face had weather in it, the lines that came from squinting into sun and wind over a long enough stretch of time. He had taken his hat off when he came inside, and he was holding it in front of him with both hands, which was the only thing about him that looked uncertain. He looked at the stove, going strong now, the iron radiating heat into the room. He looked at the pan, the pot, the flatbreads laid out on the counter. He looked at her. "You're the cook," he said. "I am," she said. Same words she'd said to Dutch. She didn't think she needed to say more than that right now. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, something quieter than that. "I didn't leave much for you to work with," he said. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one, she suspected, that she was likely to get from a man who held his hat in front of him and said things short and direct. "I found enough," she said. He looked at the stove up again. Then he nodded, once, put his hat back on, and left. She went back to rolling flatbread. When the food was ready, she put it on the table herself. The men came in from washing up at the pump. She could hear the water going, hear them talking low among themselves, the kind of talk that sounds like complaint but is really just men decompressing from a long day. They filed into the dining room and stopped when they saw the table. Not because it was anything remarkable. She knew it wasn't. Salted pork, roasted potatoes with pork bits worked through, flatbread, a small bowl of cooked down apple for each man. A meal made from almost nothing, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But there was a lot of it. She had stretched everything as far as it would go, and then a little further, and there was enough on that table that a man could eat until he wasn't hungry anymore. That was what she had been aiming for. They sat down. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Dutch reached for the pork first, the way a man reaches for something he's decided to try but isn't sure about yet. He put a piece in his mouth. She was watching the flatbread and not looking at anyone. She heard him chew, heard him swallow. "Well," Dutch said, that was all. But the man beside him, young, maybe 19, with the kind of face that didn't know yet how to be anything other than honest, reached for seconds before Dutch had finished saying the word. She let herself breathe. Garrick Hale sat at the head of the table and ate everything on his plate, and did not look at her once the entire meal. But when the table was cleared and the kitchen was quiet, and she was scrubbing the pan at the basin, she heard his chair push back from the table. She heard him pause at the kitchen door. She didn't turn around. "Supper was good," he said. She scrubbed a bit of stuck pork from the pan. "Thank you." A pause. The kind where someone is deciding whether they've said enough or not enough or something other than what they actually meant to say. "There's a supply order going out tomorrow," he said. "Write down what you need." And then his boots moved away down the hall, and the house was quiet. And Maris Rowan stood at that basin with a damp rag in her hand and felt, for the first time in 8 months, that maybe she was somewhere she could stay for a little while. She was not foolish enough to call it home. Not yet. But the stove was warm. The men were fed. And somewhere in this tired, weather-worn house, something had shifted just slightly, like a door that had been stuck for a long time moving on its hinges, just barely, just enough to let in a thin line of light. She dried her hands and finished cleaning the kitchen. Outside, the wind came across the flats the way it always did at this time of year, low and insistent, pushing against the walls of the house like it was testing them, checking for weakness. The house held, so did she. The supply order came back 3 days later, hauled in on a flatbed wagon by a man named Cutter who drove for the general store in town and who did not bother helping unload anything because, as he explained to nobody in particular while climbing back onto his seat, his back had been bad since February and showed no signs of improving. The ranch hands unloaded it themselves. Maris stood in the lean-to doorway and checked items against the list she had written. And when the last sack came off the wagon, she did a second count, slower, and discovered that Garrick had added 3 things she hadn't asked for: a second iron pan, a tin of baking powder, and a 5-pound bag of dried beans. She didn't say anything about it. She put everything away herself, organizing the pantry with the particular care of someone who had lived through empty shelves and intended never to be caught off guard by them again. The beans went in the back. The baking powder went on the second shelf at eye level, where she would always know exactly how much was left. The new pan she hung beside the old one, and for a moment she stood there looking at the two of them hanging side by side on the wall and felt something that was not quite happiness, but was in the neighborhood of it. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that because Tuesday was the day she decided to make proper biscuits for the first time, and the baking powder made that possible. And the smell that came out of that kitchen when they were in the stove was the kind of smell that travels. It went under doors and around corners and found people who were not looking for it. Dutch appeared in the kitchen doorway about 12 minutes into the baking. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. "They're not done yet," she said without turning around. "I know that," he said. He stood there anyway. When they came out, she put them on the table and went back to finish the beans she had on the stove. And when she came back to the dining room 10 minutes later, the biscuits were gone. Every one of them. The plate had been licked clean, which she chose not to acknowledge because Dutch was sitting right there, and he was 60-some years old, and she was not going to embarrass him. "You're going to spoil them," Garrick said from the doorway. He wasn't talking to Dutch. He was looking at her, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a complaint, more like a man who was watching something happen that he wasn't sure how to feel about yet. "A well-fed man works better than a hungry one," she said. "That's a theory," he said. "It's not a theory," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than felt strictly conversational, and then he walked away. Dutch waited until his footsteps faded and then said, without looking up from the table, "He's not wrong that you're going to spoil them. He's also not right that it's a problem." She didn't answer, but she filed the comment away, the way she filed most things, not discarding, not examining too closely, just keeping. The days settled into a rhythm. Not comfortable exactly. A rhythm isn't the same as comfort, but there was a shape to the days now, a predictable structure that the ranch had apparently been missing for longer than she'd realized. She got up before the light came, had coffee going before anyone else was awake. Breakfast on the table by the time boots hit the floor. Midday, she sent out something cold they could eat in the field, wrapped in cloth, tucked in the saddlebags Dutch collected for her each morning without being asked. Supper at the end of the day, always hot, always enough. It sounded simple. It was not simple. It was 6 days a week of math and timing and making decisions at 5 in the morning that would still have to be right 12 hours later. The bread she started in the morning had to be ready by supper, which meant knowing the temperature of the kitchen, which meant knowing how the stove was burning that day, which meant paying attention. She paid attention to everything. She couldn't afford not to. What she hadn't expected was how much she would learn about the men by feeding them. Dutch ate everything on his plate and never asked for more. But if she put a second helping in front of him before he could ask, he ate that too without comment, which told her he was always still hungry and too proud to say so. She started putting more on his plate from the beginning. He never mentioned it. There was a hand named Cass, who wouldn't touch anything that had onion in it. Not pick around it wouldn't touch. Full stop, plate pushed aside, face closed. She asked him once, early on, and he went red and said he didn't care for them, and she never used that word care again, but she noticed he'd lost some weight that didn't look like working weight, and she quietly started building flavor in other ways when she could. It took more work. She did it anyway. The youngest one, the one with the honest face, who she'd learned was named Noah Briggs, ate like someone who had spent enough of his life unsure whether the next meal was coming that he'd never fully stopped being nervous about it, even when it clearly was. He ate fast, he cleaned his plate, and he always looked slightly surprised when there was more available, like the abundance was a trick that might be revoked. She started leaving something out for him in the mornings before breakfast was fully ready. A piece of bread, a spoonful of preserves if she had them. Nothing formal. Just something on the counter when he came through the kitchen on his way out early, the way young men with restless energy always moved in the morning before anyone else was up. The third morning she did it, he stopped and looked at it, and then looked at her, and she was already at the stove with her back to him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. She heard him pick it up. "Thank you," he said, very quiet. "Go on," she said. "You'll be late." He went. It was around that time, maybe 10 days into her being at Iron Bluff, that she noticed the kitchen window had been reglazed. She had mentioned to no one that the draft from the cracked pane was making the kitchen harder to keep warm, but she had mentioned it inside her own head approximately 40 times because a cold kitchen was an inefficient kitchen and the crack was getting worse. One morning she came down and the glass was new. She looked at it for a while. Then she lit the stove and started the coffee. 3 days after that, the stove door that had been hanging at an angle and required lifting every time you opened or closed, it had been rehinged. It swung smooth and even. She opened it and closed it twice just to feel how it was supposed to work. Nobody mentioned it. She didn't ask. But she noticed, and she suspected that was the point, that someone was doing things that were meant to be noticed without being talked about, because talking about them would require saying something that wasn't ready to be said yet. This thought sat with her while she worked, and she tried not to examine it too carefully. The ranch was changing. She could see it in ways that had nothing to do with the kitchen. The men's energy in the morning was different now, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but she'd been watching people long enough to catch the subtle things. They came to breakfast with less of the dull, going-through-motions heaviness that had been on them that first week. There was more talking. More of that particular kind of low, easy back and forth between men who are working together well and know it. Cass had stopped sighing before he got on his horse. Dutch had started whistling something tuneless and repetitive while he checked the fence line, which she could hear in the mornings if the wind was right, and which she had decided she liked even though the song, if it was a song, made no musical sense. She caught herself humming once, alone in the kitchen mid-afternoon, and stopped and stood very still for a moment because she hadn't hummed anything in she didn't know how long. She wasn't sure that was a good sign or a bad one. She filed that away too. The conversation that changed things happened on a Thursday, which she remembered not because of the day, but because she'd been making a corn porridge that required watching, and she'd been standing at the stove when Noah came in from the east pasture early, which never happened, with a cut on his forearm that he was holding closed with his other hand and trying to act like was not a problem. "Sit down," she said. "It's fine," he said. "Noah, sit down." He sat. She was already getting the cloth she kept for burns and the tin of salt and the clean water she kept boiling on the back of the stove for exactly this kind of thing, because 6 men working hard with tools and animals all day produced exactly this kind of thing regularly. She cleaned the cut without commenting on how deep it was, which it was, more than he wanted her to know she knew. He sat very still the way young men sit when they're trying not to show that something hurts. "How'd you do it?" she asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "Fence wire," he said. "Coil snapped back." She nodded. She'd seen that before, though not on herself. Her husband had come in once with a mark across his cheek from a wire that had let go while he was tightening it, and he'd been furious about it in the way men got furious about things that scared them, and she had cleaned that too. "You should tell Garrick," she said. "It's not that bad. Not about the cut, about the fence section. If the wire's going that way, he needs to know before it gets worse." Noah was quiet for a second. Then, He doesn't really want a lot of extra talking. He wants to know if his fence is failing," she said. "That's not extra. That's his job to know." The boy looked at her with something she couldn't fully name. Not quite the way a child looks at a parent, but in that direction, like he was working out whether she could be trusted with something. "He's been better lately," Noah said. "Better how?" "He used to just walk through and not see anybody, like we were part of the scenery. Not mean about it. Just—" He stopped. "He's been asking more. About things. Talking at supper." She had noticed that herself. She hadn't said so. "That's good," she said carefully. "It's different," Noah said. He was looking at the bandage on his arm now, turning it slightly. "The ranch feels different since you came." She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she didn't know what to do with. She kept moving. She tied off the bandage and stood up and went back to the porridge. "Eat before you go back out," she said. "There's bread on the counter." Ate." She stirred the porridge. Neither of them said anything else, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which was the thing she noticed most. That evening at supper, Noah told Garrick about the fence section. Garrick listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, and said he'd ride out to look at it in the morning. Maris was at the counter when she heard that, her back to the table, and she allowed herself one small, private satisfaction before going to bring out the rest of the meal. The cattle drive was coming. She had gathered this from bits of conversation, plans mentioned over food, timelines discussed between Dutch and Garrick at the end of the table while the other men were finishing up. She pieced it together the way she had learned to piece things together, from fragments, from what people said and what they left out. The drive would take them north, through country that could be brutal in early autumn if the weather turned, and the timing mattered enormously. They needed to be through the mountain passes before the first hard snow, and that meant leaving on a specific window and hitting specific progress points each day. And all of that required the crew to be in condition to push hard for as long as it took. She started cooking for the drive before anyone told her to. She put up dried pork and hardtack and made sure the salt stores were well above what anyone expected them to be. She started curing a second batch of pork on her own, using a method her father had used and his father before him. A longer, slower brine that would keep through temperature swings better than a quick salt. It took more time. It was worth more time. Dutch found her doing it one evening and stood in the lean-to doorway watching her work. "That's the long cure," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother did that. Didn't think anyone under 60 still knew how." "My father showed me," she said. "He said short cures were for people who planned to eat it soon. Long cures were for people who planned to survive." Dutch made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your father sounds like he was a sensible man." "He had his moments," she said. Dutch leaned against the doorframe. He had the look of a man who was thinking about something more than what he was talking about, which she had learned was often how he operated. "Garrick's planning to move the drive up," he said. "A week earlier than what we talked about." She straightened up slightly. "That's... why?" "Weather reports out of the north. He thinks the window is closing." "Is he right?" "Usually is about weather." Dutch scratched his jaw. "It means the crew needs to be ready sooner." "They'll be ready," she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Somewhere between assessing and decided, which was a strange combination. "Most women would be worried about feeding a crew on a cattle drive," he said. "You're already solving it." She turned back to the pork. "Worrying doesn't fill anything," she said. He nodded and walked away. She stayed in the lean-to for a while after, working, and let herself feel the full weight of what she had agreed to, at least in her own head. She had taken on something larger than she'd originally understood, and she could see now that it would keep getting larger, because that was the nature of places like this. They expanded to fill whatever capacity you had, and then a little more. And the question wasn't whether you could handle what you'd been given, but whether you could handle what came with it. She had not expected to care about this place. She had told herself very firmly on that 2-mile walk down the rutted road that this was work and nothing more. A place to stay, a way to eat, a temporary solution to a set of problems that felt permanent. She had told herself not to get attached. She was getting attached, not to any one thing, exactly. Not yet. But to the shape of the days, to the smell of the kitchen in the morning, to the sound of boots on the porch at the end of the day. To Dutch's whistling. To the way Noah looked at the bread on the counter every morning like it was something he was still getting used to deserving. She did not examine this too closely. What she did was work. That was always what she did. When things got complicated inside, she did something outside. She moved. She made something. She fixed something that was broken. It had kept her functional for the last 8 months, and she saw no reason to change the approach now. Garrick came to the kitchen 2 nights before the drive was set to leave. The others had gone to bed. The ranch got quiet early on working nights, which she appreciated, and she used the after-hours time to do the kind of organizing that required full concentration. She was taking inventory, say, counting the jerked meat, the hardtack, the beans, working out quantities against number of men, against number of days, against variable conditions. When she heard his boots on the kitchen floor and turned to find him in the doorway, he had a mug in his hand and an expression she had started to recognize as him, working up to saying something he hadn't entirely planned. "Coffee's still on the back burner," she said, and turned back to her counting. She heard him cross to the stove, heard the quiet of him pouring. Then he was leaning against the counter a few feet away, and she could see him from the corner of her eye, not looking at her directly, looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was thinking. "You've been getting the drive supplies ready," he said. "Yes. I hadn't asked you to yet." "No." "Oh," she said. A pause. "Dutch said you're doing the long cure on the pork." "The drive could run long," she said. If the weather turns, you might be out an extra week. Short-cured pork won't hold that." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him drink his coffee. "My mother used to do the long cure," he said. She hadn't known he had a mother who cooked. She knew the mother was gone. She had figured that out quickly, from the way the house felt, from certain absences that only women tended to leave in domestic spaces, but she hadn't known the specific details. "She must have been good at planning ahead," Maris said. "She was." Another pause. Longer this time. "She ran this kitchen for 30 years. Then she got sick. I never." He stopped. Then, "I didn't do a very good job of keeping things going after." It was the most words he had said to her at one time about anything personal, and she could tell from the way he said them that this was not something he did regularly. She had the impression that this particular sentence had been waiting in him for a while and had found a way out without quite being planned. She kept counting. Not because she was indifferent to what he'd said, but because she had learned that some men could say difficult things more easily if the person they were saying them to wasn't looking directly at them, wasn't making it into a moment, wasn't waiting with a response already prepared. "You kept the ranch going," she said without turning. "That's not nothing." "The ranch," he said. "Sure." She understood the distinction. She didn't push on it. "The drive will go well," she said. "The crew is in good shape. They'll hit those passes in time. You sound sure about that." "I'm sure about what I've seen," she said. "You've got good men. They've been eating right and sleeping, and they know what they're doing. The rest is weather and luck, and you know more about weather than I do." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but had something of the shape of one. "What's your count looking like?" he said, nodding toward the supplies. She told him. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both sharp, the kind of questions that told her he had already been thinking about this and was checking her numbers against his own. And she answered them, and he nodded. "That's good," he said. That'll cover it." He finished his coffee, set the mug down. "You don't have to wait up," he said. "I know," she said. He stood there one more second, which she felt without seeing, and then he said, "Good night, Maris," and walked back down the hall, and she heard his boots on the stairs. He had used her name. He'd said it before, in passing, in the functional way of someone who needs to address a person. But this was different, the way it sat in the sentence, where there was no practical reason for it. Good night was sufficient. Good night covered all the necessary conversational ground. But the name was there anyway. She stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, looking at her supply list. Then she picked up her pencil and kept counting. The night before the drive, something happened that she hadn't anticipated and probably should have. She was in the kitchen before anyone else was up, earlier than usual, maybe 4 in the morning, because she couldn't sleep. She had the lamp low and the stove barely going, just enough heat to take the chill off while she worked through the final packing lists. And she heard the front door open quietly. She went still. Footsteps. Not Garrick. She knew his walk now. Not that she had catalogued it intentionally, but there it was. Not Dutch. Too light, too young. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed, hat in hand. She looked at him. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. She understood that. "Sit down." He sat. She poured the small amount of coffee that had come up on the back burner and put it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the mug the way very young people do when they want something to hold on to. For a minute, neither of them said anything. "I've never been on a cattle drive," he said. "I know," she said. "Dutch says it's hard." "Dutch says most things are hard," she said. "He's not wrong, but he enjoys the saying of it a little more than is strictly accurate." Noah smiled. It changed his whole face. She thought, not for the first time, that he must have been a sweet-looking child, before whatever had happened to him to put those careful eyes in that young face. "What if I can't keep up?" he said. She thought about a number of answers. She discarded most of them. "You've kept up with everything else," she said. "There's no particular reason to expect that to stop." "This is different. Most things that feel different feel that way until you're in them," she said. "Then they just feel like what you're doing." He turned the mug in his hands. "You sound like you know what that's like." She picked up her pencil again. "I've had to do a few things that felt different," she said. He thought about that. She could see him thinking about it, his expression doing the work of someone who is measuring words carefully before deciding how much to trust them. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. I know that's a strange thing to say, but it's true." Maris looked at the list in front of her. Go get some sleep, she said. You've got a long day tomorrow. He went. She sat alone in the kitchen with her lamp and her list and the stove ticking quietly as the iron warmed, and she thought about what it meant to be somewhere long enough that people started being glad you were there. She had been in a lot of places in the last 8 months. Nobody had said that to her in any of them. She was not going to let herself make too much of a 19-year-old boy being scared before a cattle drive and saying so. But she also could not entirely pretend she hadn't heard it. The drive left at first light. She was up to see them off, which was not strictly in her job description but felt necessary. She stood on the porch and Dutch tipped his hat as he passed, which was the most ceremonial thing she had ever seen Dutch do, and Cass nodded, and the others either waved or didn't, depending on their particular approach to mornings and farewells. Noah looked back once, from the gate. She raised one hand. He turned and rode. Garrick was last through the gate. He stopped his horse for a moment, not long, maybe 3 seconds, and looked back at the house, and then at her on the porch, and she had the distinct impression he was memorizing something, though she couldn't have said what. Then he put his heels to the horse and was gone. She stood on the porch until the last of them had cleared the rise and the dust was settling back down into the road. Then she went inside and started planning what the kitchen would look like when they came back. She had 2 weeks, maybe 3, and there was work to be done on the ranch while they were gone. A garden bed that needed winterizing, a supply of preserved food that she intended to expand significantly, and a cracked section of shelving in the pantry that she had been looking at for 10 days, and that she was going to fix herself because she was tired of looking at it. She was not going to sit and wait. She was not built for sitting and waiting. She found Garrick's toolbox in the lean-to and pulled out what she needed and went to work on the shelving before noon. She split her thumb on the hammer on the second day. A glancing blow, nothing serious, but it bled more than it should, and she sat on the kitchen floor for a few minutes, pressing a cloth to it and feeling a particular brand of annoyance that had nothing to do with the thumb and everything to do with the fact that she was being forced to stop doing something before it was finished. She had always been bad at stopping before things were finished. The shelving got done by the 3rd day. She stood back and looked at it, flexed her bandaged thumb, and decided it was acceptable. Then she started on the garden bed. The days were long without the crew to feed. She hadn't expected to notice their absence as much as she did. The kitchen had a different quality when she cooked only for herself. Smaller somehow, quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful so much as reduced. She ate simply, without much attention, and saved her real cooking energy for the batches of preserved food she was building for the return. She thought about the cattle drive more than was probably useful. She thought about the weather, about the mountain passes, about whether the window Garrick had calculated was right. She thought about Noah on his first drive, whether he was keeping up, whether he was eating enough. She thought about Dutch's bad knee, which she had noticed him favoring on cold mornings, and which would not improve in mountain country in early autumn. She thought about Garrick's face at the gate. 3 seconds, the specific quality of it. She did not let herself think too long about that last one. 2 weeks and 4 days after the drive left, she was in the garden when she heard horses on the road. She stood up slowly, shading her eyes. They came in smaller than they'd left. Not fewer men, but quieter, the way people come back from hard work rather than going out to it. Dusty and lean and moving with that particular economy of motion that long days in the saddle produce. But they were all there. She counted without meaning to, and they were all there. Noah was grinning from 20 yards out, which was the most immediately legible thing about the group. Dutch looked like a man who had slept badly for 2 weeks and was ready to be done having feelings about it. Garrick looked, she noticed, and told herself she wasn't noticing, like a man who had just done a hard thing successfully and was not quite sure yet how to carry that. "Cattle's through," Dutch said, dismounting with a wince he was mostly controlling. "Made the pass with 3 days to spare." "I know," she said. "You made it. Come inside." She had supper ready. She had known, in that particular way she had developed of knowing things without being told, approximately when they would return. The food had been going since that morning. The kitchen was warm. The table was set. They came in and sat down, and for a moment before anyone picked up a fork, the dining room held a silence that was different from the usual kind. Not empty. Full of something that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. Dutch looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "You always know," he said. It was an observation, not exactly a compliment, more like a man acknowledging something that exceeded his ability to account for. "Not always," she said. "Eat." They ate. And Garrick, at the head of the table, said something that he had not said before in her presence, something casual and easy, directed at the table at large, and he laughed at the response he got. And it was not a big laugh, not the kind that throws your head back, but it was real. She heard it from the kitchen where she was putting the last of the biscuits on a plate, and she stood still for a second with the plate in her hands and listened to the sound of it. It was new. That sound in that house. She brought the biscuits out and set them on the table and didn't say anything, and the conversation kept going around her, and she went back to the kitchen. And the sound followed her through the wall like something that had been waiting a long time to exist and was now in no hurry to stop. Outside, the first cold of the season was coming down from the north, the way Garrick had said it would. The passes were closed behind them now, the window shut. They had made it through. She cleaned the kitchen and let herself just for a moment feel the full specific weight of being somewhere that felt like it might be. Against every reasonable expectation, somewhere she was supposed to be. Then she put the cloth down, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in 8 months. The morning after the crew came back, Maris woke up at her usual hour and lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn quiet, aware of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. The particular absence of dread that she had gotten so used to carrying that she'd stopped noticing it was there until it wasn't. She got up and made coffee and started breakfast, and the house filled with the sounds of men moving around upstairs, and the smell of something warm coming from the kitchen, and all of it was ordinary and all of it was enough. That was the word she kept coming back to in the days that followed. Enough. Not more than enough. Not overflowing, not perfect, not the kind of contentment she'd read about in books when she was young, and believed that kind of contentment was a real thing people actually felt. Just enough. The kitchen was warm, the food was good, the men were recovering from the drive, slower in the mornings, quieter at supper, sleeping hard, and she adjusted for that without being asked. Smaller portions of harder things, more bread, more fat in the cooking, more calories without more volume, the way you fed people who needed to rebuild from the inside out. Dutch's knee was worse than she'd thought. She noticed it on the second morning when he came down the stairs with his hand on the railing in a way that said the knee was not cooperating. She didn't mention it at breakfast. But that afternoon she made a compress out of a cloth bag and some dried herbs she'd found in the back of the pantry. She wasn't a healer and she didn't claim to be, but her mother had used heat and willow bark for joint pain, and the herbs she'd found smelled enough like what she remembered. And she left it on the counter near the stove where it would stay warm, with a note underneath that said only, "For the knee." 20 minutes before bed. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Dutch came into the kitchen the next morning walking noticeably better, said nothing whatsoever about the compress, and poured himself coffee. When he sat down at the table, he looked at her with an expression that a less perceptive person might have mistaken for neutrality. "Good coffee this morning," he said. "Same as every morning," she said. "Then it's consistently good," he said, and picked up his mug, and that was all either of them said about it. The ranch settled into its post-drive quiet, and Maris used the slower pace to do something she had been putting off since she arrived. She took stock of everything. Not just the kitchen, the whole of what she'd come to understand about this place and the people in it. She did this privately, the way she did most thinking, while her hands were busy with something else. While she kneaded bread, or turned pork in the pan, or swept the kitchen floor in the early dark before anyone was awake. What she understood was this. Iron Bluff had been a good ranch once, and it could be a good ranch again, and the main thing standing between it and that future was not money or land or luck. It was the fact that for 2 or 3 years, she wasn't sure exactly how long, and didn't ask. The people on it had been going through the motions without anyone paying attention to the small things that added up. The window with the cracked pane, the stove door that hung wrong, the shelving in the pantry, the knee that nobody acknowledged. These were not large problems, but they were the kind of problems that accumulated, and accumulated things had weight, and weight wore people down, and worn down people made worn down decisions, and that was how places went from good to gone. She thought about all of this while she worked, and she didn't share any of it with anyone because it wasn't her place to say, and also because some things were better understood privately first, and maybe later, maybe, said out loud in the right moment to the right person. Garrick was harder to read in the days after the drive. Not colder, not that, but more inward. She noticed him in the evening sitting at the end of the porch alone, not with his coffee, not with anything, just sitting. She did not interrupt him. She understood solitude when she saw it, and she understood that some kinds of solitude were not loneliness but work, the kind of interior work that couldn't be done with people around. One evening, about a week after the drive, she brought a mug out anyway and set it on the railing beside him and turned to go back in. "Stay," he said. Not a question, not a command, something between. She stayed. She stood at the railing and looked out at the dark the way he was looking at it. "You're thinking about next year," she said. It was not a guess. He exhaled. The drive paid enough to clear the debt to Whitmore, got enough left over to fix the east fence line and put up for winter stores. A pause. "Might be able to take on another hand in spring." "Noah's going to be good," she said. "He was good on the drive." He said it like it surprised him slightly, which told her he had not been certain before they left and was now recalculating. "He works hard," she said. "He's got something to prove, which can go wrong, but usually goes right at his age if somebody's watching out for him." Garrick looked at her sideways. "You've been watching out for him?" "A little," she said. "More than a little," he said. Not accusatory, just accurate. She didn't argue it. The boy was 19 and had come to this ranch from somewhere that had not been kind to him. She had pieced this together without asking, the same way she pieced together most things. And somebody needed to notice that, and she had noticed it, and that was all. "He reminds me of my brother," Garrick said. She was quiet because she hadn't known there was a brother. "Had a brother," Garrick said. Flat correction. "Younger, Chester. He died of a fever 11 years ago. He was 20. She kept looking at the dark. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it in the plain way, not the decorated way. "How was—" Garrick stopped. Chester was the one people liked. He had a way of walking into a room, and the room got easier. "I was never like that." He said it without self-pity, just as information, the way a man states a fact about the weather. When he died, it was like, the ranch lost something it couldn't name. My mother felt it most. She lasted 4 more years. Maris said nothing. The wind came across the flat ground and moved the dry grass at the edge of the yard, and the horses shifted in the corral. "Then it was just me in this place," he said. She understood suddenly, not just intellectually but in her body, the whole weight of what she had walked into when she had come down that rutted road with 30 cents and a split seam. She had thought she was coming to a ranch that needed a cook. She had been right about that. But she had been right about a much smaller version of the truth. "Iron Bluff is still standing," she said. "You kept it standing for 11 years by yourself." "That's not nothing, Garrick." I was quiet for a long moment. She had used his name. She hadn't planned to. It had just arrived at the end of the sentence, and now it was out there, and she couldn't take it back, and she wasn't sure she would have even if she could. "No," he said finally. "I suppose it isn't." They stood on the porch a while longer, not talking, and the quiet between them was a different kind of quiet than the silences she was used to from him. Less like absence and more like two people occupying the same space and neither one of them minding. She went in when it got cold, said goodnight, and he said goodnight back, and she went upstairs and lay in the dark for a while before sleeping and thought about brothers who died young and mothers who lasted 4 more years and men who kept ranches standing by themselves for a long time, and whether that was enough or whether enough was even the right word for that kind of endurance. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. She woke the next morning with the thought still there, quieter but present, and she got up and made coffee and went about the day. It was a Thursday in the second week of October when the stranger's horse appeared on the road. Maris was outside. She had been winterizing the kitchen garden, cutting back the dead growth, covering the beds she wanted to protect, working through the systematic list she had made 3 weeks ago, and had been executing section by section when the afternoon light allowed for it. She heard the horse before she saw it because she had been paying attention to sounds since she arrived, the way people pay attention to sounds when they've lived through enough unexpected arrivals to know that the sound always comes first. She looked up. The horse was a good one. Bay, well-fed, with tack that was expensive enough to have been bought new recently. The man on it was dressed in the kind of clothes that said money without saying it loudly, which was its own kind of saying it. A wool coat, gloves, a hat that sat correctly on his head because it had been chosen to fit rather than bought from a shelf and made to do. It was maybe 50, with a neat beard going gray and pale eyes that she saw from 20 feet away and recognized before she consciously knew why. There was something in the face, the structure of it, the set of the jaw, that pulled at something she was not immediately able to name, and then she was. And when she named it, she felt the cold that had nothing to do with October. She knew that jaw. She had lived with a version of it for 6 years. The man reined his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at her with an expression she knew too. The particular expression of a man who thinks he has already won something and is now just proceeding with the formality of collecting it. "You'd be Maris," he said. Not a question. She straightened up from the garden bed and held her pruning shears in her right hand and said nothing. "I'm Silas," he said. "Silas Rowan, Ellis's brother." He smiled. "I imagine you know that." She knew it. She had known it from the jaw and the pale eyes and the quality of that expression, which Ellis had worn occasionally when he held a hand he thought was better than the other man's and hadn't yet learned it wasn't. Her husband's brother, who she had seen 3 times in 6 years of marriage, twice at Christmas and once at Ellis's funeral, where he had wept with impressive conviction and then 3 days later presented her with a document claiming Ellis had owed him $400 that she had no record of and no reason to believe existed. She had not paid it. She had not been able to pay it, even if she'd wanted to, because Ellis had left her nothing to pay anything with. And Silas had known that. The document, she had come to understand, was not about money. It was about something else, and that something else was why he was here now, on a good horse, looking at her with that smile. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "what brings you out this way?" "Business," he said. He looked around the yard with an assessing quality, taking in the fencing and the barn and the main house with the particular attention of a man who is calculating values. "Seems you've landed somewhere comfortable." "I work here," she said. "So I heard." He dismounted, which she hadn't invited him to do. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked toward her, and she held her ground without moving. "That's why I came. I've been looking for you, Maris, several months now." "Why?" she said, though she knew. "Because you left owing me money," he said. "And that tends to follow a person, in my experience." The shears in her hand, the garden bed behind her, the house 20 feet away with nobody currently visible on the porch. But Dutch somewhere inside, she knew, because his hat was on the hook by the door. "I don't owe you money," she said. "You do," he said. He said it pleasantly. That was the worst part of Silas. She remembered this now with the clarity of something that had been stored carefully and was now being retrieved. He was pleasant. He was pleasant the way a man was pleasant when he had decided that the conversation was already over and was just waiting for the other person to realize it. $420. Ellis borrowed it 18 months before he died, and I have the paper to prove it. "You have a paper you wrote," she said. He tilted his head. "Now that's a serious accusation." "It's what I believe," she said. "What you believe isn't what a judge believes," he said, and some of the pleasantness shifted slightly. Not disappearing, but thinning, the way ice thins in early spring, still looks solid until it isn't. "And I've looked into your situation, Maris. I know what you have, which is to say I know what you don't have. You can't afford a legal dispute, and you know it." She heard the back door of the house open, heard boots on the porch boards. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on Silas. "This is private property," she said. "You weren't invited." "Came to see the owner," Silas said. He looked past her shoulder and she heard the footsteps slow and then stop. "Hale," Silas said. "Garrick Hale. I've heard of your family. Good reputation in this county." He extended his hand in the direction of the approaching footsteps. "Silas Rowan. I'm the brother of this woman's late husband." She turned then. Garrick was on the edge of the yard, not the porch, which meant he'd come around from the side of the house, which meant he'd seen the horse from somewhere and had come out the long way. His hat was on, his jacket was not. He looked at Silas's extended hand and then at Silas and then, briefly, at Maris. She kept her face level. Garrick did not shake the hand. "What do you want?" he said. Silas lowered his hand without embarrassment, which was a skill. "Just came to speak with your cook," he said, "about an outstanding debt she owes my family." "There is no debt," Maris said. "She says that," Silas said, to Garrick specifically, which was the move she had been expecting. Go around her. Go to the man. Make it a conversation between men about a woman. "I have documentation. Now, I don't want any trouble. I just want what's owed, a matter of $420. He paused to let that number settle. "If she can't produce it, I'm willing to discuss terms." Garrick looked at Mary, this time longer. She could not tell what he was thinking. She had gotten better at reading him over these weeks, but this was a face she hadn't seen before. Not closed exactly, but held, the way a man held something while he was still deciding what to do with it. "This isn't the place," Garrick said. Or the time. You can come back tomorrow if you've got something to say. Silas nodded, still pleasant. Of course. I understand. He looked at Maris one more time, and the pleasantness in his face had something underneath it that she felt in her chest. The way you feel a wrong note in music. Not with your ears exactly, but somewhere more interior than that. Good to see you looking well, Maris. You always did land on your feet. He untied his horse and mounted and rode back down the road. And she stood in the garden and watched him go until the dust settled. And then she stood there a little longer. She heard Garrick walk up behind her. You want to tell me what that was? He said. It wasn't exactly a question. It was the shape of one. She kept her eyes on the empty road. He's my husband's brother. He showed up 3 days after the funeral with a document claiming Ellis owed him money. I don't believe the document is real. I had nothing to pay it with, even if it was, and I left. She turned. That's the truth of it. Garrick's face was still held. Is there a legal dispute? He said. Not a formal one, she said. He threatened one. I don't know if he'd actually pursue it. A lawyer would cost him more than $400 if I contested it. But you can't afford a lawyer. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. I can't. He nodded slowly. Go on and finish what you were doing, he said. I'll handle tomorrow. You don't need to handle it, she said. I'll handle tomorrow, he said again, and walked back to the house. She turned back to the garden and stood there with the shears in her hand and felt something that she did not immediately want to examine, which was the specific feeling of someone else standing between her and a problem. She had not had that in a long time. She was not sure what to do with it. She went back to cutting. She slept badly that night. Not the sleeplessness of panic. She was past panic. She had burned through that particular fuel in the months before she came here. But the lighter, more aggravating sleeplessness of a mind that would not stop sorting through variables. She thought about Silas's document and what exactly it might say, and whether she could dispute it and on what grounds. She thought about Garrick's face in the yard. She thought about what Silas had said. You always did land on your feet. And the specific quality of contempt inside it, the implication that landing on her feet was somehow a trick rather than a consequence of surviving things that would have stopped most people. She thought about the travel bag she kept packed under her bed. She had packed it the third day after arriving at Iron Bluff. Not because she planned to leave, but because she always had an exit. She had learned that from the last 2 years of her marriage, when everything could change overnight, and having nothing ready was the difference between getting out and not getting out. The bag was there. It had been there since the beginning. She had not unpacked it. She had in fact added the 30 cents to it early on, before she'd been paid. Because 30 cents was 30 cents, and you never left yourself with nothing. Lying in the dark, she became aware, for the first time in weeks, that the bag was there. She hadn't thought about it in a while. She'd been too busy, too present in the specific demands of each day to spare attention for the exit strategy running quietly in the background. She thought about it now. Silas would come back tomorrow, and he would be pleasant, and he would say things in front of Garrick that were designed to make her look like something she was not. And the question was what Garrick would do with what he heard, and whether she trusted him to see through it. She barely knew him. She knew his coffee preference and the way he asked questions and the fact that he'd had a brother named Chester who died at 20, and that he laughed rarely, but when he did, it was real. She knew that he fixed things quietly and said things plainly, and had kept this ranch going alone for 11 years. She knew he had not shaken Silas's hand. She held on to that in the dark. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. By morning, she had made a decision, which was that she was not going to pack anything further into the bag under the bed, and she was not going to think about the road, and she was going to make breakfast and get through the day and see what Silas brought with him when he came back and deal with that specifically, rather than inventing variations on it at 4 in the morning. She made the coffee. She made the biscuits. She set the table. The men came down and she watched their faces to see if Garrick had said anything, and she couldn't tell, which probably meant he hadn't. After breakfast, when the others had gone out, Noah stayed. He had a habit of being the last one in the kitchen, not for any stated reason, but because he liked the warmth of it, she thought, or liked the particular quiet before he went out to the day's work. This morning he sat at the table with his coffee and looked at her in a way that made her think he knew something. "Who was that man yesterday?" he said. "My husband's brother," she said. "I saw him from the barn." He turned the mug in his hands. "He didn't look friendly." "He isn't," she said. "Is there going to be trouble?" She looked at him. He was 19 years old and he was asking her a straight question with that honest face, and she was not going to lie to him. Maybe, she said, not the kind that can't be handled. He nodded like he was filing that away. Dutch says if anybody gives you a hard time, he's going to make their life difficult, Noah said. She stopped. Dutch said that. Not to you, Noah said quickly. To Cass, this morning. I wasn't supposed to hear it. She stood there with the dishcloth in her hands and felt something happen in her chest that she was not going to call what it actually was, because that would have required sitting down, and she did not sit down. Go to work, she said. He went. Silas came at noon. He came with a man she didn't recognize, younger, thick through the shoulders, the kind of man people brought when they wanted to imply something without stating it. They rode in together and tied up at the fence, and Silas knocked on the front door with the comfortable authority of someone who expected to be let in. Garrick opened it. Maris was in the kitchen, which was where she had decided to be, because she was not going to hide, but she was also not going to perform for Silas Rowan by standing on the porch, waiting. She heard the front door open, heard voices, low, then coming toward the back of the house. They came into the kitchen. All three of them, Garrick, Silas, and the thick-shouldered man who stood just inside the doorway and did not introduce himself and did not need to because his function was already clear. Maris kept her hands on the counter and turned to face them. Mrs. Rowan, Silas said. He looked around the kitchen with that assessing quality again. Slower this time, more deliberate, like a man pricing everything in the room. You've made yourself at home. I work here, she said. Same words, same tone. She was not going to let him reframe the vocabulary. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, which he placed on the kitchen table with a flat palm press, the gesture of someone laying down a card they think ends the hand. Signed by Ellis. Witnessed by a notary. He tapped it. $420, borrowed 18 months before his death for a business investment that didn't pay out. He meant to repay it. He never got the chance. She looked at the document on the table. She did not pick it up. May I? Garrick said to Silas. Silas gestured at it. Garrick picked it up and read it. His face told her nothing, which was beginning to be a specific kind of frustrating. Investment in what? Garrick said. A freighting concern, Silas said. Out of Denver. Didn't survive its second year. Ellis wasn't a business investor, Maris said. People surprise you, Silas said mildly. Ellis could not have given you $400, she said. He didn't have $400. He hadn't had $400 at any point in the 2 years before he died. I kept the household accounts. I know what came in and what went out, and nothing went out in that amount in the period you're describing. Borrowed from a third party, Silas said. Passed through my account. Then show the third party's records, she said. Something moved in his pleasant expression. A tightening, barely visible. I came here to resolve this peaceably, he said. Not to be cross-examined by who, she said. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands flat on the counter. By the woman who paid every one of Ellis's legitimate debts out of what she could find and sell after his funeral, and then left when there was nothing left to pay? I paid what was real. I don't pay what isn't. Silas looked at Garrick. You see what I've been dealing with, he said. I see a document, Garrick said. He set it back on the table. I also hear a woman saying she kept the household accounts and has no record of this. Those are two different things, and one of them is verifiable and one of them isn't. My word, Silas started. Isn't what I asked about, Garrick said. There was a pause. The thick-shouldered man in the doorway shifted his weight, which was the most he'd done since arriving. I can get you the third-party records, Silas said. Still pleasant, but thinner. It'll take time. Take all the time you need, Garrick said. Until you've got them, there's nothing to discuss. Come back when you have the full documentation. Silas looked at him for a moment with an expression that wanted to remain pleasant and was working harder at it than before. Then he picked up his document from the table, folded it, put it back in his coat. I'll be back, he said. I expect so, Garrick said. Silas looked at Maris one more time, that look, the calculating one, the one that said he was revising his approach rather than abandoning it. And then he turned and walked out, the thick-shouldered man falling in behind him. They heard the front door. They heard the horses. They heard the sound fading down the road. In the kitchen, Garrick and Maris stood on opposite sides of the table, and the silence was the kind that comes right after a thing is over, but before either person has decided what that means. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. Not harshly, just don't put it there between them as something that needed to be thanked, she thought. Don't make it bigger than what it was, which was a man who had a cook, who was being lied about, and had asked for the documentation, and that was all it was. She thought that was probably not all it was, but she let it stand. He's going to come back, she said. He doesn't have third-party records because there aren't any, but he'll have something. He'll find something, or he'll make something, and he'll come back with it, and he'll be louder next time. Probably, Garrick said. When he does, she said, I want you to let me handle it. He looked at her. I know what I'm dealing with, she said. I've had time to think about it, and I know how he works. I don't need you to defend me. I need you to let me defend myself. He considered that. She could see him considering it, not in a dismissive way, the way some men considered women's opinions on their own situations, but actually turning it over, weighing it. All right, he said. All right? She hadn't expected it to be that simple. You know him. I don't. He shrugged, one shoulder, the gesture of a man who has decided something and is not making ceremony of it. You say you can handle it. I believe you. She stood there and felt the weight of those words settle on her in a way she hadn't anticipated. I believe you. 3 words. People use them casually, use them without thinking, but they landed differently when they came from a person who was not casual about most things, and thought before he spoke and had watched her for weeks before saying anything at all. She turned back to the counter. There'll be bread ready at supper, she said. He left the kitchen, and she stood at the counter for a long moment before she started working again. Silas did not come back that week. She had known he wouldn't. He was regrouping, reassessing, working out his next angle. She had lived adjacent to that kind of thinking long enough to know its timeline. He would be back inside 2 weeks. She used the time to think. She went through her memory of the weeks after Ellis's death with a thoroughness she hadn't applied to it before, because before she had been too raw and too exhausted and too occupied with the immediate catastrophe to do anything other than survive it. Now she was not raw. Now she was fed and housed and had slept consistently for weeks and had the capacity to actually examine what she knew. She knew that Ellis had owed money. This was not in dispute. Ellis had always owed money. It was the central fact of their marriage, the thing she had learned to navigate around and compensate for and not talk about at tables where people would hear. He had been a man of tremendous charm and mediocre judgment, and she had loved him for the charm and managed the judgment for 6 years, and that was the honest accounting of it. She knew what he had owed and to whom because she had been the one who managed the household. She had a memory for numbers the way some people had a memory for faces. Clear, specific, reliable. She could tell you the exact amount of every debt Ellis had carried at the time of his death. She could tell you when each debt had been incurred and what it was for. She had paid all of them except the ones that were demonstrably unpayable with no assets and no income, and one of those was Silas's $420. What she also knew, and had not said aloud to anyone yet, was that there was a record, not of the debt, which she was certain did not exist, but of the period Silas was describing. She had kept the household accounts in a ledger, a small, brown leather book purchased from the stationer in town before the stationer went out of business, with a clasp on the front that never quite closed properly. She had kept every entry in it for 4 years. Every expenditure, every income, every transaction. She had taken it with her when she left because she had known, with the particular knowledge of a woman who has been living next door to financial chaos for 6 years, that she might need it. She had it. It was in the bag under her bed. The ledger was not a legal document. It was her own record, kept in her own hand. But it was detailed and it was consistent, and it covered every month of the period Silas claimed Ellis had borrowed from him. And there was nothing in it, not a hint, not a gap, not an anomaly, that corresponded to a $400 movement of any kind. She had thought about showing it to Garrick. She had decided not to, not yet. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she wanted to be the one who handled this. And the moment she handed it to someone else, it became someone else's card to play. She was not ready to do that. She wanted to know exactly when and how to use it, and she would know that better when she saw what Silas came back with. What she hadn't anticipated was that the damage would start before he came back. It was Dutch who told her. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon with an expression she had not seen on him before, uncomfortable in the particular way of a man who is about to say something he wishes he did not have to say. He stood in the doorway and didn't sit down. "Heard something in town yesterday," he said. She kept her hands on the bread she was working and didn't say anything, which was her way of saying, "Go on." "People are talking," Dutch said. "About you. About the man who came to the ranch. His name is circulating, Silas Rowan. And he's been saying things at the feed store and the livery and probably everywhere that has more than 3 people in it." "What kind of things?" she said. Dutch looked at the wall. "Saying you ran from a debt. Saying you've been moving from place to place since your husband died to avoid it catching up with you." A pause. "Saying you're—" He stopped. "I'm going to tell you what he said because you need to know, and then I'm going to tell you what I think, which is that he's lying." "Go ahead," she said. "He's saying you stole money from the estate before the creditors could reach it, that you hid assets." She stopped working the bread. She stood very still with her hands on the dough and felt the particular cold that came with hearing a lie that was specifically shaped to be hard to disprove. Because that was the beauty of it, from Silas's perspective. You couldn't easily disprove a negative. You couldn't hand someone proof that you hadn't done something. All you could do was stand there and say, "I didn't," and people looked at you and decided for themselves. "He's wrong," she said. I know he's wrong," Dutch said, with a flatness that left no room for interpretation. "I know what I've seen here, and I know what a woman running from something looks like, and it doesn't look like you." He cleared his throat. "But I thought you should know what's coming." She turned back to the bread. Her hands worked it automatically while her mind ran the variables. "What's the mood in town?" she said. Dutch made a sound that was not quite comfortable. "Mixed. People who know me and the ranch tend to be skeptical. People who don't have no reason to be skeptical one way or the other." He paused. "And Silas Rowan apparently buys a lot of people, a lot of drinks when he talks." She understood. Drinks opened ears and ears made decisions, and decisions accumulated. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I didn't tell Garrick," Dutch said. "Thought that was yours to do." She looked at him then. He was looking at the wall again, which was his way of doing something kind while pretending he wasn't. "Dutch," she said. "What?" "Thank you." He grunted and walked out, and she turned back to the bread, and she worked it harder than she needed to, and thought about ledgers and liars, and the specific velocity at which reputation could be destroyed in a small county where everyone knew everyone, and a well-dressed stranger with money for drinks could cover a lot of ground in a short time. She had to tell Garrick. She didn't want to. Not because she was afraid of what he would think. She had weighed that already, and believed she knew. But because telling him meant making it his problem, and she had spent the last 8 months trying very hard not to become anyone's problem. She had carried everything herself, because the alternative was dependency, and dependency was the thing that had nearly killed her twice already. But she had also told him she could handle it, and handling it required him knowing the shape of it, because the shape had expanded since she'd said that, and a man could not stand beside you if he didn't know what he was standing beside you against. She told him that evening after supper when the others had gone out. She sat down at the kitchen table, which was unusual. She almost never sat. Kitchens were for moving. And she told him what Dutch had said, and then she told him the rest of it, the full version, starting from the beginning. Ellis's gambling. The debts. The ledger she had kept and was still keeping in the bag under her bed. Silas's arrival at the funeral. The document she was certain was forged. The way she had left with nothing except what was genuinely hers, and the ledger that proved it. She talked for maybe 15 minutes. She did not perform it. She did not make it smaller than it was to seem less burdened or larger than it was to seem more sympathetic. She just said it, the way she had always believed things should be said, which was plainly and in order. When she finished, Garrick was looking at the table. A long moment passed. "The ledger," he said. "You've had it the whole time." "Yes." "And it covers the full period he's claiming, every month of it." I was quiet for another moment. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" he said, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Because I wanted to see what he had first," she said. "I still do. If I show the ledger before he shows his documentation, it's just my word against his word, and neither of us has the advantage. If he shows his documentation first, I can show the ledger alongside it and let people compare." Garrick looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, but thought she might eventually. "That's a better strategy than most men I know would come up with," he said. "I've had time to think about it," she said. "And you're not scared," he said. It sounded like he meant it as a question, but it came out as an observation. She looked at him. "I'm scared," she said. "I've been scared since he rode up yesterday. I just don't let it make the decisions." Something shifted in his face, open in a way it usually wasn't. "All right," he said. "Then we wait for him to come back, and when he does, he comes in front of everybody. Not just me and you in the kitchen. Everybody." He paused. "If he wants to say things, let him say them where the whole ranch can hear it. And when he's done, you say what's true." She looked at him. "You do that." "He's already saying things in town," Garrick said. "That ship's gone. The only thing left is to make sure the people on this ranch hear the truth from you before they hear the lie from somewhere else." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. They sat for a moment in the kitchen, the two of them on opposite sides of the table, and the lamp burned between them, and the house was quiet around them. And outside the wind moved across the flat ground in the dark, low and cold, and coming from the north. She had come here with 30 cents and a split seam and nowhere to go. She had told herself it was temporary. She had kept the bag packed. She had tried very hard not to need this place or these people or any of it. She looked at Garrick Hale across the kitchen table and thought about all of that, and thought about the ledger under her bed, and thought about what it meant to have someone say "I believe you" and mean it without reservation. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the house. The house held. So did she. But somewhere down the road, she knew, Silas Rowan was preparing his next move, and whatever he brought back would be worse than what he'd come with the first time, because men like Silas did not ride away to regroup and come back smaller. They came back with more. She cleared the table, turned off the lamp, and went upstairs. She did not look at the bag under the bed. She lay down and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her and thought, "Let him come." He came back on a Saturday. Maris knew it would be a Saturday because Saturdays were when the ranch hands were most likely to be around in the middle of the day, not out on the range, not scattered across the property. And Silas had watched enough of the ranch's rhythms on his first 2 visits to know that. He would want an audience. That was the whole point. Not the money, not the document, not the legal dispute that was never going to survive any serious examination. The point was the audience. She had known this for 11 days. She had used those 11 days the way she used most waiting. She kept working, she kept feeding people, and she thought. The ranch had felt different in those 11 days. Not tense, exactly. More like the particular quality of air before weather. Everything continuing in its ordinary shape, but with something underneath it that everyone felt and nobody named. The men came to breakfast and ate, and went to work, and came back and ate again, and the routine held, but there were small signs. Dutch stayed closer to the main buildings than usual. Cass had taken to sitting on the porch after supper instead of going straight to the bunkhouse, which he had never done before. Noah found reasons to be in the kitchen more often, which she pretended not to notice because noticing it would have made him self-conscious about something that was genuinely kind. Garrick said nothing more about Silas after that evening at the kitchen table. He didn't avoid the topic exactly. He didn't avoid anything. She had come to understand that about him. Avoidance wasn't in his particular set of habits. He was just waiting. The same way she was waiting, with the same quality of patience that was not passive but active. The kind of waiting that was actually a form of preparation. She got the ledger out the night before, not to look at it. She knew every entry in it, could have recited the columns from memory, but because she needed to know exactly where it was, needed to have it in her hand once, and put it somewhere specific so that when the moment came, she would not be searching for it. She sat on the edge of her bed with the small brown leather book in her lap, the clasp that didn't close properly falling open the way it always did, and she turned to the months Silas was claiming. October through December, 2 years before Ellis died. The entries were in her handwriting, small and consistent, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write with care because paper cost money and wasting it was not acceptable. Household expenses, food costs, what Ellis brought in from his work at the freight company before he lost that job, what she brought in from the 2 families she cooked for on Thursday and Friday afternoons. Every number present, every column balanced. No $400. No $100. No outgoing transaction of any unusual size in the entire 12-month window on either side of Silas's claimed date. She put the ledger on the nightstand where she could reach it in the morning and went to sleep earlier than she expected to, which was either a sign that she had made peace with what was coming or a sign that her body had simply reached the limit of what anxiety it was willing to sustain and had decided to be done with it for the night. In the morning, she made breakfast and fed the crew and washed the dishes and put the ledger in the pocket of her apron, which was deep enough to hold it, and went on with the day. Silas arrived at 10:30. He came with 3 men this time, not just the thick-shouldered one from before. 3, one of whom she recognized from the description Dutch had given her as a man named Prentice, who sometimes worked as a hired witness in county disputes, a professional presence whose job was to stand somewhere visible and be remembered as having been there. The other 2 she didn't know. He did not come to the door this time. He rode into the yard and stopped his horse and raised his voice. "Garrick Hale," he called. "I'd like a word." She was in the kitchen. She heard it through the window. She dried her hands on the dishcloth, took one breath, felt the ledger solid and rectangular in her apron pocket, and walked to the back door and out onto the porch. The yard was already filling. Dutch came from the direction of the barn. Cass and 2 of the other hands materialized from somewhere behind the equipment shed. Noah came from the east side of the house at something close to a run and then slowed himself when he saw the gathering shape of things, which was a sign of better judgment than she would have expected 3 weeks ago. Garrick came off the front porch and walked into the yard and stopped with the son behind him. Silas took in the assembled people with an expression that said this was exactly what he'd wanted. "Good," he said. "Good, I'm glad everyone's here, because what I have to say concerns all of you." He dismounted and stood in the middle of the yard and looked around at the faces. "You've got a woman in your kitchen who owes my family money. $420, borrowed by her late husband, never repaid." He paused for effect. "That's not the worst of it. While I was looking into this matter, I spoke to people in the county where she lived before she came here, and what they told me is that when her husband died, there was money in that house. Not much, but some. Enough to cover most of what he owed." He let that sit. It was gone by the time the creditors arrived. She took it. He produced the document again. Then, from his coat, a second piece of paper. "I have a signed statement from a neighbor," he said, holding the second paper up. "A woman who lived across the road from the Rowan house. She states that she saw Maris Rowan removing items from the property the night before the creditors came. Items that were later listed as missing from the estate." The yard was quiet. She felt the shift in the air. Not the men turning against her, nothing so dramatic and definitive, but the particular quality of people who are listening to something and not yet sure what to do with it. That uncertainty was Silas's weapon. He didn't need to convince them. He only needed to make them unsure. She stepped down from the porch. She walked into the yard, not quickly, and she stopped when she was close enough that she didn't need to raise her voice. "May I see the statement?" she said. Silas looked at her. Something adjusted in his pleasant expression, a slight recalibration, the way a man recalibrates when the other person does something he didn't predict. "This is between me and—" "You brought it into this yard," she said, "in front of these people. So it's between you and everyone here. May I see the statement?" A pause. He handed it to her. She read it. She read it twice, slowly, because she was not going to miss anything, and she was not going to react to it before she understood exactly what it said. The statement was signed by a woman named Clara Ebb. She remembered Clara Ebb. Clara Ebb was 63 years old and lived across the road and had a long-standing opinion that the Rowan family were not the right sort of people for this part of town. An opinion she had expressed on several occasions with the particular certainty of someone who had decided something long ago and was not interested in revising it. The statement said that Clara had seen Maris carrying a trunk out of the house the evening before the estate was evaluated. Maris looked up from the paper. "She's right," she said. The yard went very still. Silas's expression moved toward something that was not quite triumph, but was practicing for it. "She's right that I carried a trunk out," Maris said. "I carried it out because it contained my own clothing and my mother's quilt and the household ledger I had kept for 4 years, none of which belonged to the estate, all of which were mine personally." She reached into her apron pocket and produced the ledger. "This ledger, which I have kept since the 2nd year of my marriage, recording every transaction in the Rowan household, every cent that came in and every cent that went out, for 4 years." She opened it to the month Silas had specified and held it up. "Mr. Rowan claims his money was borrowed 18 months before Ellis died. That falls in this section here. October, November, December." She turned the book so the nearest men could see the pages. "There is no $400 transaction in this period. There is no $100 transaction. There is no anomaly of any kind." She closed the book but kept it in her hand. "There is no transaction because there was no loan. Ellis didn't have $400 to borrow with, and Silas Rowan didn't give it to him." Silas's pleasant expression was working harder than she had ever seen it work. "A ledger you kept yourself," he said, "that you could have written anything in." "Yes," she said. I could have. You could have written anything in that statement. She held up the paper. Clara Ebb is 70 yards from a road. She saw me carrying a trunk. She didn't see what was in it, and she doesn't say so, because she didn't know. She assumed. That's what that statement is. It's an assumption from a woman who already didn't like my family, put on paper by you, and called a fact. She handed the statement back to him. He took it. His hand was steady, but there was something in the line of his jaw that wasn't, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things, filed it, used it. You have a document you say Ellis signed, she said. Let me ask you something. In the 4 years I kept that ledger, I recorded every debt Ellis carried. I can name every person he borrowed from, what the amount was, and when it was repaid or not. If Ellis borrowed $400 from you, it would have come into the household in some form. It would have gone somewhere I could see. It's not here. She held up the ledger again. So I'd like to know, where did it go? What was it spent on? The investment, you said. A freighting concern out of Denver. What was its name? Silas said nothing. Who ran it? She said. Still nothing. If Ellis invested in a freighting concern, there would be a record, she said. A letter. A receipt. A single piece of correspondence. Did you bring any of that? The yard was quiet in a different way now. Not uncertain. Attentive. Silas's jaw worked. I don't carry every document I own when I ride out, he started. You carried 2 today, she said. You came prepared. You've had 11 days since your last visit to gather whatever you needed. She kept her voice even, kept the ledger in her hand, kept her eyes on him. I'm asking for the name of the freighting concern my husband supposedly invested in with your $400. Just the name, that's all. The silence stretched. It was Dutch who spoke first, from somewhere to her left, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had decided something and was in no particular hurry about saying it. I knew Ellis Rowan, Dutch said. Silas looked at him. Not well, Dutch said. Crossed paths in Caldwell about 9 years back. He was working freight at the time. Man could talk a horse into giving up its shoes. Charming as sin. A pause. He was also the kind of man who, if he had $400, would have lost it at cards within a month. He didn't invest in freighting concerns. He didn't invest in anything. He spent what he had, and then he borrowed more, and Maris here spent 6 years managing the back end of that. Dutch looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has heard enough and has stopped performing patience about it. I don't know you, but I know that type, and you've got it on you. You came here looking for money from a woman who doesn't have any, and you dressed it up in paper and a hired witness because that's what your type does when they can't get it any other way. Silas's face had gone very still. Cass spoke up from the other side of the yard, unexpectedly. Cass, who rarely spoke at volume, who was the quietest man on the ranch, who she had fed without onions for weeks, without making anything of it. Is that man a professional witness? Cass said. He was pointing at Prentice, who was standing near Silas's horse with the expression of a man who had recently begun to regret his life choices. Because I've seen him at the Caldwell courthouse twice in the last 3 years, both times standing next to someone making a claim that didn't hold up. Prentice said nothing. His horse moved slightly, and he let it put a step between him and Silas. Silas was looking at the group in the yard and doing a fast count that was coming up short. She could see it in his eyes. The calculation of a man who came in expecting 4 against 1 and was now finding the arithmetic had changed significantly. He looked at Garrick. Garrick had not spoken. He had stood at the edge of the yard with his arms at his sides and let it unfold, the way he had said he would, and the way he was standing was not neutral. There was nothing neutral about it, but he had kept his word that she would handle it, and he had, and now Silas was looking at him the way a man looks for a door when he's realized the room is smaller than he thought. Hail, Silas said. Surely you see. I see a woman with a ledger, Garrick said, and a man with a document he can't support, and a statement about a trunk. He paused. I also see that you've been in this county for 2 weeks talking about my employee in feed stores and livery stables and anywhere that had an ear. I don't appreciate that. Your employee has outstanding. She has nothing outstanding, Garrick said. She has nothing outstanding because you haven't proven she does. You've shown me a paper with a dead man's signature and a second paper with an old woman's assumption on it. And when she asked you a direct question about the name of the business, you can't answer it. He let that sit. You're going to leave this property now. You're not going to come back. And if I hear that you're still circulating stories in this county about anyone connected to this ranch, I'm going to have a conversation with my lawyer about what we call it when a man damages someone's reputation on the basis of fabricated evidence. Silas looked at the yard, at Dutch, at Cass, at Noah, who was standing with his arms crossed and his young face doing something it didn't usually do, which was look very certain. At the two men Silas had brought who were now standing somewhat apart from him in the way people stood apart from something they no longer wanted to be associated with. Prentice, slowly and without ceremony, walked to his horse, untied it, and mounted. He did not look at Silas as he rode out of the yard. One of the other men followed, not the thick-shouldered one from the first visit, a younger man with a nervous quality who had been nervous since arriving and was now resolving it in the only direction available. The thick-shouldered man stayed. He looked at Silas and then at the remaining people in the yard, and then he looked at Dutch specifically, who was looking back at him with no particular expression, just looking, steady and unhurried. The thick-shouldered man untied his horse. I didn't say anything. He mounted and rode. Silas stood in the yard with his document in his hand and looked at Maris. She waited. Whatever he was looking for in her face, fear or uncertainty, or the particular kind of resignation that told him this could still be salvaged. He did not find it. She was not performing courage. She was not holding herself stiff against it. She was simply standing in the yard of a place she had worked for 2 months, and looking at a man who had come to take something from her and had found she had nothing for him, which was not entirely accurate. She had plenty. She had a ledger full of truth and a yard full of people who had seen what he was, but she had nothing he could take. And that was different. And it was the thing he couldn't find in her face because it wasn't fear. It was done. She saw him understand that. He put the document back in his coat. He straightened the lapels the way men straighten things when they were trying to recover a dignity they had already lost and knew it. He looked at Garrick one more time, and whatever he was going to say, he decided against it, and he mounted his horse and rode out of the yard and down the road without looking back. The yard was quiet. And then Dutch made a sound that was more definitive than anything he had said in a while, a short exhale that functioned as his complete commentary on what had just occurred, and turned and walked back toward the barn. Cass looked at Maris and then looked at the road, and then said, to no one in particular, that man spent money on witnesses and didn't check if they'd stay, and also walked back toward the equipment shed. The others dispersed in ones and twos the way they always dispersed, with the particular understatement of men who had seen something and would not make a production of having seen it. Noah was the last one standing there. He looked at Maris with his honest face and opened his mouth, and she said, before he could, go on, there's still half a morning left. He grinned, which was that whole face thing he did, and went. She and Garrick were alone in the yard. She stood with the ledger in her hand and the October light coming down at an angle and felt the specific aftermath of something hard being over. Not triumphant, not the way it was described in stories, not light and released, more like the feeling of putting down something heavy that you'd carried a long way, where your arms still had the shape of carrying it even though it was down. You did that cleanly, Garrick said. He didn't have anything, she said. He just had the willingness to say it out loud. Most people count on the saying being enough, he said. I know, she said. It usually is. A pause. He was looking at the road where the dust had settled. She was looking at the ledger in her hand. The neighbor's statement, he said. Clara Ebb, she really saw you with the trunk. Yes, Maris said. She really did. You weren't worried he'd use that? She considered. I was worried. But it was true, and the truth of it was in my favor if I told all of it, instead of just the part he told. You can't be afraid of the truth just because someone's using it wrong. Garrick was quiet for a moment. I want to talk to you about something, he said. She looked at him. His hat was pushed back slightly, the way it went when he'd been out in the sun for a while, and he had the look she had come to associate with him deciding to say something he'd been deciding for a while. Later, he said. Tonight, if that's all right. All right, she said. She went back to the kitchen. The afternoon was ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary after the morning. She made lunch for the crew. They came in quieter than usual, with the focused appetite of men who had burned some energy on something that wasn't physical. And she fed them and sent them back out and cleaned up and started on supper. She thought about Silas on the road, where he would go, whether he would try again somewhere else, or whether what had happened this morning was sufficient to finish it. She thought it was sufficient. Men like Silas ran on the fuel of other people's fear and uncertainty, and when that fuel was gone, they found another direction, because pressing forward without it was too expensive. He would leave the county, maybe not immediately, but soon. He would go where nobody knew the story yet and start another one. She found she did not feel triumphant about that either, just relieved. The specific, unglamorous relief of a problem being actually finished. She was rolling out pie crust when Noah came back in mid-afternoon with an armload of wood for the stove that she hadn't asked for. She looked at him. "Dutch told me to," he said. She looked back at the pie crust. "Thank you," she said. He set the wood in the box and then stood there for a moment, in the way he stood when he had something to say that he hadn't quite assembled yet. "This morning," he started. "Noah." "I know," he said, "but I just want to say that—" "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't have to." A pause. "I want to." She stopped rolling and looked at him and waited. "My mother died when I was 6, he said. "My father didn't. He wasn't around after that. I was in 3 different households before I was 12, and none of them were particularly interested in whether I ate or how much. He was not performing this. He was saying it the way people say things that they've carried long enough that the weight is just normal, and the saying of it doesn't require bracing anymore. I didn't know what it was like to have someone put food on a counter before you were up in the morning because they noticed you were nervous before you came here." She stood with the rolling pin in her hand and felt something in her chest that was not comfortable but was necessary. "I'm not your mother," she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "I know that," he said. "I didn't say you were." He looked at the floor and then back at her. "I just wanted you to know that I noticed, that it mattered." She turned back to the pie crust. "Go tell Dutch I'm making apple pie for supper," she said. She heard him smile. She didn't see it, but she had spent enough time in this kitchen to know the sounds that went with it. "He's going to want 2 pieces, Noah said. "He's getting one like everyone else," she said. "Go." He went. She kept rolling, and the crust was not perfect. She'd overworked it slightly, and it would be a little tough on the edges. And she kept going anyway, because that was how it was. You kept going, and you did the best you could with what you had, and sometimes the edges were tough, and it was still a pie. Evening came, and the supper was good, and the crew ate, and the conversation was fuller than usual, the way conversation got after something had happened and people were processing it sideways, through talk about other things. Dutch told a story about a land dispute he'd witnessed 20 years ago in another county that was clearly a commentary on the morning's events, but dressed up in enough distance that nobody had to acknowledge it. Cass laughed at the end of it, which was unusual. Cass laughed rarely, and when he did it was short and surprise-sounding, like he'd gotten to the funny part before he expected to. Noah ate 2 helpings of everything without the nervous speed he'd had when she first arrived, taking his time, actually tasting it, and she noticed this and said nothing. Garrick ate and listened and didn't say much, which was his way. But at the end of the meal, when the others were pushing back from the table, he looked at her across the room with that look, the one she didn't have a name for yet, and she nodded, a small motion, and he nodded back. After. She cleaned the kitchen. The pie plates came back empty, and Dutch's had a clean scrape quality that said he'd considered the bowl, but maintained some dignity about it. She washed everything and put it away and wiped down the counter and hung the dishcloths to dry and did all of it with the methodical care that meant she was thinking about something else. She was thinking about what Garrick wanted to say. She had been thinking about it since he said it this morning, and she had tried several times in the afternoon to stop thinking about it, because thinking about it was not productive until she knew what it was, and she didn't know what it was, and yet she kept thinking about it because the particular quality of how he had said it, "I want to talk to you about something," had a weight in it that was not routine. She had a guess. She was not going to say it even inside her own head because guessing was its own kind of vulnerability, and she had enough of those. She dried her hands and went to the back porch. He was already there. No coffee this time. He was just standing at the railing, hat in hand again, the way she'd noticed he held it when he was uncertain, not performing uncertainty, just experiencing it through his hands, needing something to hold. She stood beside him at the railing and they both looked out at the dark the way they'd done before. "I've been trying to work out how to say this," he said. "Say it plain," she said. "That works better for you anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "When I hired a cook," he said, "I thought I was solving a practical problem. 6 men, no meals, drive coming up." "I know," she said. "You solved that," he said. "And then you solved other things I didn't know were problems. Dutch's knee, the window." The way Noah eats now versus how he ate when you got here. A pause. The way this house sounds. She was looking at the dark. It sounds different, he said. There's laughing at the table. Dutch told that story tonight and Cass laughed, and I don't know the last time Cass laughed. I've been paying wages to that man for 4 years. He shifted his grip on the hat. That's not a cook. That's not what a cook does. A cook feeds people. You fed something else, and I don't know what to call it. She let the words settle. I'm not trying to make it into something it isn't, she said. I just do what needs doing. That's what I mean, he said. You see what needs doing without being told, and then you do it, and you don't make ceremony of it. That's... He stopped, started again. My mother was like that. Not identical, but that quality of just doing what the situation required. She kept this place together with that quality for 30 years. Garrick, I'm not finished, he said. Not sharp, just asking for the space to finish. She waited. What happened this morning, he said. Silas, the yard, the ledger. You had that planned. You knew how it would go, and you prepared for it, and you handled it, and you asked me to let you do it yourself, and I did, and you were right. He looked at the dark. I've been doing this ranch by myself for 11 years, and I've had hands who were loyal, and Dutch, who's worth 5 men, and I've managed, but I've been managing. That's different from... He stopped again. This is coming out wrong. It's coming out fine, she said. He looked at her. I don't want you here as the cook, he said. I want you here because this place makes more sense with you in it. And I know that's a strange thing to say to someone who walked in 8 weeks ago. And I know you've got reasons to be careful about what you trust and who you trust it to, and I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. He looked back at the dark. I'm asking you to know that I'm saying it, that I see what you bring here and it's not work I'm paying for, and I don't want to pay for it because that's not what I want it to be. She stood very still. He kept going because he had clearly prepared this and was going to get through it. I know you've got that bag packed under your bed, he said. She turned and looked at him. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to unpack it. I'm just saying that if you wanted to, nobody here would think the worse of you for it. The dark beyond the railing, the cold coming off the flats, the horses in the corral and the lamplight through the kitchen window behind them. She had stood on porches before. She had stood on the porch of the house she'd shared with Ellis and watched the night and thought about what her life was, and tried to be honest about it, even when honesty was not comfortable. She had been honest then. She was going to be honest now. I told myself this was temporary, she said. I know, he said. I told myself that every week. Did you believe it? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was no. She had not believed it for several weeks. She had kept telling herself because the alternative was admitting that she had stopped running, and the last time she had stopped running, it had cost her everything. No, she said. He nodded. Not triumphant. He wasn't built for triumph. She had learned that about him. Just receiving it. I'm not Ellis, he said. I know that. I'm not easy, he said. I don't say things right the first time usually. I work too long and I go quiet when I should probably talk. And I didn't keep this house the way it should have been kept and let things get worse than they needed to. He was looking at his hat. I'm a better ranch than I am a person, probably. She almost smiled. She caught it. That's not true, she said. Mostly true, he said. No, she said. You fixed the window before you said a word about it. You rehinged the stove door. You added baking powder and a second pan to the supply order because you noticed what was missing. People who are better ranches than people don't do that. They fix the things they can see. They don't fix the things other people can't see. He was quiet. I'm not perfect either, she said. I keep a bag packed under the bed because I've learned the hard way that you don't leave yourself with nothing. I manage people's food because it's the only way I know to manage people. I don't ask for help even when I need it, and I'm working on that, and it's slow. She looked at the dark. And I was married for 6 years to a man I loved who made decisions that were not good decisions, and I managed around those decisions for 6 years. And that shapes a person in ways that don't disappear just because the situation changes. I know, he said. Do you? No, he said honestly. Not from the inside, but I know it's there, and I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't. The wind came across the flat and pushed at them, and they both felt it, and neither of them moved. I'm not saying yes to anything tonight, she said. I'm not asking for yes tonight, he said. I'm saying... She stopped, started again. I'm saying that the bag is there because I put it there and I don't unpack things I put somewhere on purpose without thinking carefully about it first. That's reasonable, he said. But I'm also saying, she stopped again. She was not as good at this as she wanted to be. She was better at bread and ledgers and managing problems than she was at this specific kind of saying. I'm saying I heard what you said. He looked at her. And it's the first time in a long time that something someone said to me changed how the ground felt under my feet, she said. A long pause. That's enough, he said quietly. For tonight, that's enough. She nodded. She said good night and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a minute in the dark, without lighting the lamp, just standing there. She could feel the house around her, solid and imperfect. The stove that swung right now, the window that didn't draft anymore, the shelving she'd fixed herself with a borrowed hammer and a split thumb. She went upstairs. She stood beside her bed. She reached down and picked up the travel bag and set it on the bed and opened it. She looked at the things inside it. The extra dress she'd packed in case the one she was wearing wore out. The small pouch with the 30 cents she'd been adding to since she started getting paid. The folded document that was her marriage certificate because she'd learned you needed proof of who you were sometimes, and you didn't always know when. The spare pencil for the ledger. She did not unpack it. She had said she would think carefully, and she meant it, but she closed the clasp and set it back down, and this time she did not slide it under the bed. She set it in the corner, by the door, where she could see it. That was different from where it had been. She wasn't sure yet what it meant. She was not going to decide what it meant tonight. She lay down and listened to the house. And outside the wind moved across the flat, cold ground, and the house held the way it always held. And the stove door downstairs swung easy on its re-hinged frame, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, Dutch was probably putting a compress on his knee and not saying anything about it to anyone. She closed her eyes. The ground felt different than it had this morning. She fell asleep before she had decided whether that was good or terrifying or both, which was probably the most honest answer anyway. The word about Silas Rowan spread the way. Things spread in small counties, not all at once, but in the particular accumulating way of water finding its level, moving through every low point and crack until it had covered everything it was going to cover. Dutch had been in town 3 days after the yard confrontation, ostensibly for a supply run, and he had come back with an empty wagon bed and a full account of what people were saying. Prentice, the professional witness, had apparently made his own calculation about which direction the wind was blowing and had spoken to 2 men at the feed store about what he'd seen. Not as confession, more as a man repositioning himself, making clear that he hadn't known the full picture when he agreed to stand in that yard, which was probably partially true and certainly convenient. The effect was the same regardless of his motivation. A witness to Silas's scheme was now publicly distancing himself from it. And in a county where everyone's reputation was their most portable asset, that distance traveled. Silas had been seen at the hotel in Caldwell for 2 more days after the yard, and then he had not been seen again. His horse was gone from the livery. His room was vacated and paid for, which Dutch noted with the tone of a man who found the payment itself suspicious. Men who left quietly and paid their bills in full were men who knew they were leaving and had decided not to give anyone a reason to follow. "He's gone," Dutch told her, standing in the kitchen doorway the way he always stood in doorways, as though he wasn't quite sure he'd been invited past the threshold. "For now," she said. "Probably for good," Dutch said. "His type needs new territory once the old one's used up. There's nothing left for him here." She thought about that. She thought about what it meant for a person to use up a territory, to extract whatever they could from other people's uncertainty until the uncertainty was gone and they had to find new uncertainty somewhere else. It was a particular kind of life. She did not feel sorry for Silas Rowan, but she understood that people like him were not born scheming. Something had made the calculation for them somewhere early on that taking was easier than building, and by the time a man was 50 and well-dressed and riding into strangers' yards to collect debts that didn't exist, the calculation had been running so long it had become invisible to him. He probably believed it. That was the worst part, she thought. He probably believed most of it by now. She did not say any of this to Dutch. She said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing, and Dutch took that as the end of the conversation and went back to the barn. The days after Silas left had a different quality than the days before he'd arrived. Not dramatically different. The work was the same, the meals were the same, the rhythm of the ranch continued without ceremony. But the tension that had been running underneath everything for 2 weeks was gone, and its absence was palpable in the way the absence of a headache was palpable. You didn't notice it until it stopped. The crew felt it. Even Cass, who processed everything internally and expressed very little of it externally, seemed lighter in a way that showed in how he moved rather than anything he said. Dutch stopped staying close to the main buildings and went back to his usual wide-ranging pattern across the property. Noah stopped finding reasons to be in the kitchen every afternoon, which Maris took as the healthiest possible sign. He had been watching out for her in his 19-year-old way, and now he didn't feel the need to, and that meant the need was gone. She found herself, in the week that followed, doing something she hadn't done in a long time, thinking about the future in a way that was not defensive, not planning for problems or building exits, just thinking forward. What the kitchen would look like in spring when the garden beds came up. Whether she could get more variety into the preserved food stores if she started earlier next year. Whether the cellar needed proper shelving installed or whether the existing arrangement could be improved with less effort. Next year. She caught herself thinking the phrase and stood still in the pantry for a moment with a jar of beans in her hand, just registering it. She had not thought in terms of next year in relation to any specific place for a long time. She had thought in terms of what was immediately necessary, and occasionally in terms of what she might need to survive the next season, but not next year in this kitchen, in this house, with these people. She put the beans on the shelf and went back to work and did not make a ceremony of it. Garrick had not said anything more about what he'd said on the porch. She had not brought it up. This was not avoidance. She was not built for avoidance any more than he was. But both of them seemed to understand without discussing it that the thing had been said and it was now sitting between them like something that needed time to become what it was going to become, and pressing it would not accelerate that process. It would only make it awkward, and awkwardness was not a thing either of them were interested in when there was work to be done. She was aware of him differently, though. She had been aware of him before, in the functional way you were aware of the person you worked for, his preferences, his schedule, his habits. Now she was aware of him in a way that had more texture to it. The way he came into the kitchen in the morning before anyone else was up, not for coffee, but just to stand there for a minute in the warm, and then went back out before she had to acknowledge that she'd seen him. The way he talked to the horses, not at length, just a word or two, the kind of brief address you gave to something you were in a long relationship with. The way he'd started laughing slightly more often at supper, not performing it, just occasionally finding something actually funny, which was different from before when he'd sometimes smiled at things, but the laugh was always held back somewhere. She noticed these things, and she let herself notice them, and she did not apologize to herself for noticing. The conversation she hadn't expected came from Dutch. It was a Tuesday, which had become a kind of meaningful day at Iron Bluff, without anyone planning it. The supply runs came back on Tuesdays. The week's work got assessed and redirected on Tuesdays. And Maris had fallen into the habit of making something slightly better than ordinary on Tuesday evenings, because the end of the supply run meant a full pantry, and she could afford to. This particular Tuesday, she was making a proper stew with actual beef, the first time she'd had the ingredients for it all at once. And the smell was doing what good smells did in that house now, which was travel. Dutch came in the back and sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was new. He had always stood in doorways. Sitting was a different kind of presence. She kept stirring the stew and waited. "You know what this ranch was like before you came," he said. "I can guess," she said. "I've been here 8 years," Dutch said. "I've seen it go through things. The year Chester died, the year after the drought that took most of the east pasture grass. The year Garrick tried to run a second cattle operation up north and it failed and cost him more than he could afford, and he didn't speak for about 3 months that I noticed." He folded his hands on the table. "I've seen this place get small. The way places get small when people inside them are managing rather than living." She was quiet. She kept stirring. "It's not small anymore," Dutch said. She didn't answer immediately. "That's not just me," she said. "No," Dutch agreed, "but you're a significant part of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, so I'll say this plainly. Whatever you're thinking about whether to stay or not, I hope you'll stay. Not because the food is good, though it is. Because this place is better with you in it, and the people in it are better, and I'm too old to watch it go small again." She had been expecting something like this, in the abstract, but not this specifically, and not from Dutch, who was the most economical person she had ever met with anything that could be called sentiment. She turned around. He was looking at the table, not at her, which was his way of making the vulnerability of what he'd said slightly more manageable for both of them. "Thank you, Dutch," she said. He nodded once and stood up and left the kitchen. She turned back to the stew and stirred it and stood there for a while thinking about what it meant when the people around you were not just tolerating you, but were, in their various and imperfect ways, asking you to stay. Not out of neediness. Not because they couldn't manage without you. They had managed before, however poorly. But because they had gotten a glimpse of what it was like to live differently, and they didn't want to go back. She understood that. She had been living differently since she arrived here too. The stew was good that night, genuinely good. The kind of meal that had the right amount of everything, and had been given enough time to become something more than the sum of its ingredients. The crew ate in a way that said they knew they were having something worth having, not rushing it, letting it be what it was. Dutch had 2 helpings and said nothing about either, which was his highest form of praise. Noah, at his end of the table, was telling a story about something that had happened with one of the horses that morning, a story that was funnier than it should have been because of how he was telling it, and Cass, who she had once thought constitutionally incapable of being entertained, was smiling in that short, surprised way of his, and even the 2 quieter hands who rarely contributed to the table conversation were following along and reacting. Garrick, at the head, was watching it happen. Not watching the story exactly. Watching the table. The way you watch something when you were trying to memorize it. He looked up and caught her looking at him from the kitchen doorway, and she did not look away, and neither did he. And that was a moment, the kind that was ordinary and not ordinary at the same time, that contained something that did not require naming to be real. Then Noah got to the punchline of his story, and the table laughed and the moment folded back into the evening. She brought out the last of the biscuits and went back to the kitchen. 3 days later, in the early morning before anyone was up, she reached under the bed for the bag, and she was not there. She stood there for a second before she remembered she'd moved it to the corner by the door where she could see it, and she crossed to the corner and picked it up and set it on the bed. She opened it, the extra dress, the small pouch of money, more than 30 cents now, she'd been saving steadily. The marriage certificate, the ledger, which she took out and set on the nightstand because it lived on the nightstand now and not in the bag. The spare pencil. She stood there with the open bag on the bed and she thought about what the bag meant. It meant she was someone who kept a door open. It meant she had learned, at significant cost, that you didn't leave yourself with nothing. It meant she had survived things by refusing to be caught unprepared. All of those things were still true. She was still that person. The bag did not unmake any of that. But there was a difference between keeping a door open because you needed a way out and keeping a door open because you'd never allowed yourself to believe the room itself was safe. She had been doing both for so long they had become the same thing in her mind. They were not the same thing. She took the extra dress out of the bag and hung it on the hook on the back of the door where her working dress usually lived. She moved the working dress to the chair. She put the money pouch in the drawer of the nightstand. She put the marriage certificate, which she might still need someday, you never knew. Practical was not the same as afraid, in the ledger for safekeeping. The bag was empty now. She folded it along its original creases and put it in the bottom drawer of the dresser, where it would be if she needed it. She stood in the morning light and registered what she had done. Then she went downstairs and made coffee. She did not say anything about it to anyone. It was not the kind of thing that required saying. Garrick found her in the garden that afternoon. She was doing the last of the winterizing, the final closing down of things that needed to sleep before the cold got serious, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground and looked up. He stood at the edge of the garden bed with his hat in his hands and the look on his face that she had finally found a name for, which was open. He looked open, not vulnerable in a way that was uncomfortable, but open in the way of someone who had decided to stop keeping a thing in and was dealing with the aftermath of that decision in real time. She waited. "I said I wasn't asking for anything tonight," he said. "The other night on the porch, I said that." "You did," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how long I was planning to stick to that," he said. She almost smiled. "And?" she said. He looked at his hat. "It turns out I'm not very patient when I know what I want." She straightened up from the garden bed. The cold was in the air with real intent now, the kind of cold that was not a warning but a statement about what was coming. "What do you want?" she said. He looked at her with that open face. "I want you to stay here," he said. "Not as the cook, as I want you to stay here as mine, and I want to be yours. And I know that's a large thing to say, And I know your history with large things being said and then not going the way they were supposed to. And I can't promise you it'll be easy or that I'll always say the right thing, because I won't. I've already told you I usually don't." He stopped. "But I can promise you I mean it. And I can promise you the stove will always have wood, and the window won't crack again, and whatever breaks, I will fix it, or I'll tell you it's broken, and we'll figure it out together. And I can promise you I will not gamble. I do not gamble. I never have, and I'm not starting." He said that last part with a specificity that told her he had thought about what her particular fears would be and was addressing them directly, which was the most Garrick Hale thing she could have imagined him doing. She stood in the garden with frost on the ground and looked at him. He was not polished about this. He had not prepared a beautiful speech. He had said it the way he said most things, which was plainly and in order and without decoration, and some of it was slightly awkward, and none of it was rehearsed, and all of it was real. She had been proposed to once before. Ellis had been charming about it. Ellis had said the right things in the right order, and she had believed every word, and she had been right to believe them at the time, because he had meant them at the time. And the problem was not what he'd said on that day, but who he'd turned out to be on all the other days. She was not going to let what Ellis had been make her unable to see what Garrick was. That was its own kind of damage, the kind that outlasted the thing that caused it and kept collecting interest, and she had been paying that interest for long enough. She looked at Garrick Hale standing at the edge of her garden, with his hat in his hands and his face open and his voice plain, and she saw what he was, which was a man who kept his ranch going alone for 11 years and fixed things quietly and added baking powder to supply orders and didn't shake hands with men he didn't trust and said things once and meant them. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said again, because once had not seemed like enough. He exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale, just a man who had been holding something and had now put it down. He crossed the garden to her, stepping carefully over the covered beds, which she noticed and which was, in its small way, entirely characteristic of him. And he stood in front of her and he put his hand out, and she put her hand in it. His hand was cold. So was hers. Neither of them mentioned it. "We'll do this right," he said. "When you're ready. There's no rush." "I know," she said. He nodded. He did not kiss her. It was not that kind of moment. It was colder than that and more real and more solid, like a foundation being laid rather than a flag being planted. She understood the difference between the two, and she was glad it was the foundation kind. He walked back toward the barn, and she watched him go. And she turned back to the garden and finished what she had been doing before he'd arrived, because the garden still needed to be closed down before the hard frost, and it wasn't going to close itself. And that was the thing about life at Iron Bluff. It kept going, and you kept doing what needed doing, and the large things happened in between the ordinary ones, and then you went back to the ordinary ones, and they were better for it, she told Dutch first. Not because she was asking permission, but because Dutch had sat down at her kitchen table and said he hoped she would stay, and he deserved to hear that she was staying. She told him the next morning, briefly, while he was getting his coffee. "Good," he said. She waited. "That's it?" she said. "What else is there to say?" Dutch said. "I'm not surprised. I haven't been surprised for 3 weeks. He picked up his mug and looked into it. He fixed the window before he said 10 words to you. A man who does that is not hard to read. She stared at him. "You knew," she said. "I'm 64 years old," Dutch said. "I've watched people my entire life. Yes, I knew." He took a sip of coffee. "I also knew you'd take your time about it," which was right. You should take your time about things like that. The ones who rush it are the ones who get it wrong. He set the mug down. "When's the wedding?" "We haven't discussed it." "Spring's easier," he said, as if she'd asked for his opinion. "Ground's not frozen. People can travel if they need to. Work's not as heavy before the drive planning starts." She looked at him. "Dutch," she said. "What?" "Make your own breakfast this morning." He looked at her for a second, and then something happened on his face that she had never seen before. An actual smile, not the near-miss expression she'd catalogued over 2 months, but an actual smile, brief and real. He made his own breakfast. She told Noah that afternoon. He was in the yard working with one of the younger horses, a patient and repetitive kind of work that required more presence than skill, and she walked out and leaned on the fence and watched for a minute before she said it. When she did, he stopped what he was doing and looked at her. His face did the whole face thing. She had come to love that about him. The way his face couldn't do anything partially, it just gave everything all at once. Good, he said. Dutch said the same thing, she said, but Dutch was talking about it in the bunkhouse 2 weeks ago, Noah said. She turned and looked at the house to avoid the expression she couldn't fully control. Nobody told me, she said. We didn't want to make it weird, Noah said. She stood at the fence with the cold air coming off the mountains in the north and felt the specific warmth of being known by people. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, in the particular way that came from sharing ordinary days long enough that you stopped performing and started just being. She had not had that since before Ellis started losing things, maybe longer than that. She pushed off the fence and went back to the kitchen. They married in March, when the ground had thawed enough to feel like land again, rather than iron. It was not a large wedding. Dutch stood beside Garrick, and Noah stood near Maris and Cass, and the other hand sat in the front 2 rows of the small church in town and wore their cleanest shirts, which was an achievement for some of them and a minor miracle for others. The ceremony was short, and the vows were plain, and the Reverend did not say anything she found objectionable. Garrick stumbled very slightly on one line. She heard it, felt him gather himself, and he finished it without stopping. And she found she loved him more for it, for the fact that this large and serious man had gotten nervous in the good way in front of a room of people who already knew both of them and would not think less of him for it. Afterward there was food, because she had made it, because of course she had. She had been up since 4 in the morning on her wedding day, making the food for the reception, and she would not have had it any other way. Dutch had tried to intervene the day before. "You shouldn't cook on your own wedding day," he said. "Why not?" she said. He had not had a good answer for this. "It's not how it's done," he tried. "I'm the best cook available and I want the food to be good," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. The food was good. They went home to Iron Bluff that evening, which was the same place they'd been every evening for months, but which was different now in a way that did not require explaining to the people who lived there and would not have been adequately explainable to anyone who didn't. The house received them the way houses received people who belonged in them. The stove was warm. Dutch had kept it going, she found out later, had been checking it all day to make sure it was warm when they got back, which she did not mention to him and which she thought about sometimes in the years that followed when she was trying to remember what Dutch was actually made of underneath all that economy. Spring came, and with it, the planning for the summer season, and Maris sat at the table with Garrick and worked through the numbers alongside him, which was new for both of them and occasionally rough-edged. They did not always agree, and the first real disagreement they had, about whether to take on a particular contract for supplying beef to a camp operation 2 counties over, was conducted at some volume in the kitchen and ended without either of them entirely winning, which she later concluded was the correct outcome. They split the difference. The contract worked out moderately well. Neither of them said "told you so," which was its own kind of progress. The east fence got replaced that spring, properly this time, not patched. Garrick hired 2 men to do it, and Noah worked alongside them and learned more in those 3 weeks than he had in the previous year about the mechanics of how a ranch boundary held or failed. And she watched him come in at the end of those days, exhausted and purposeful, in a way she recognized as the look of someone who was becoming the person they were going to be. I was 20 now. He had been on 2 cattle drives, both successful. He could read the weather off the mountains better than any of the other hands, which Dutch had acknowledged in the particular Dutch fashion of saying nothing about it but asking Noah's opinion on it every time it mattered. He had stopped eating fast. He had stopped looking surprised that there was enough. She did not think of herself as his mother. She did not need to be. She had simply been the first person in a while who had noticed him eating too fast and done something about it. And that was enough to have changed something, and that was a fact she returned to occasionally when she was thinking about what it meant to be present in someone's life. You didn't always need to be the biggest thing. Sometimes you needed to be the person who put bread on the counter in the morning and went back to the stove and let them feel that they deserved it. The cattle drive that second summer went further and better than the first. They came back with enough to put a real addition on the barn and to sink a proper well on the south pasture and to buy 2 more horses, which Noah selected, which she trusted him to do because Dutch trusted him to do it. And Dutch was not wrong about things he paid attention to. Iron Bluff expanded, not explosively but steadily, the way things expanded when they were built on work that was genuine and repeated rather than luck or spectacle. They took on another hand the following spring, a quiet man of 35 named Reyes, who was methodical and good with equipment, and who ate everything she put in front of him with the focused appreciation of someone who had spent time eating badly and did not take good food for granted. She liked him immediately. Dutch's knee had a bad winter that second year, and she made the compress every night and argued with him twice about whether he needed to see a doctor in town and won once, which was her actual track record with Dutch on medical matters, and which she accepted as about as good as it was going to get. The doctor in town confirmed that the knee was arthritic and would not get better but could be managed, and Dutch came home from that appointment and sat in the kitchen and drank her coffee and said nothing about the appointment and said after a while, "Good coffee. Same as every morning," she said. "Consistently good," he said. It was the same exchange they'd had after the first batch of biscuits, a year and a half earlier. She thought he knew that. She thought he'd done it on purpose. She did not point this out, so began to keep a second ledger. Not the household accounts, which she continued with the same precision she had always applied. She would keep those until there was no more household to account for. It was simply part of how she was organized, but a different kind of record. Less numerical, more like notes, written in the evening when the house was quiet, about what she had noticed that day. What had worked and what hadn't in the kitchen. What Noah had done or said that struck her as significant. What Garrick had been thinking about as best as she could read it. Observations about the land, the seasons, what the ranch needed, and when. It was not a diary. She had never kept a diary. It was more like the habit of her ledger mind applied to something that didn't have columns. The practice of noticing things and writing them down because things that were not written down were at risk of being lost, and she had lost enough things. One evening, about 2 years after the wedding, Garrick came into the kitchen late and found her at the table with the second ledger and her cup of tea going cold beside her. He looked at it. "What's that?" "Notes," she said. He sat down across from her. He looked at the book without reaching for it, which was right. He would not read something of hers without being invited. She knew that by now. "What kind of notes?" he said. She thought about how to answer this. "I keep track of things," she said. "I always have. The household accounts because that's practical, but this is other things. What I noticed, what happened, what I want to remember." I was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" he said. She looked at the page she'd been writing. She turned the ledger toward him. He read it. It was half a page. It was about that morning, about the way the light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle in autumn, and about Dutch whistling the tuneless thing in the yard, and about the way Garrick had laughed at breakfast at something Noah said, and how it was still the kind of laugh that started small and opened up, and she was still not tired of hearing it. He looked up from the page. She waited. "You wrote about me laughing at breakfast," he said. "I write about things I want to remember," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. She could not fully read his face in the lamplight, but she didn't need to. She knew the texture of his silences well enough by now to know this was the kind where something was happening inside that was too full to come out as words right away. "Maris," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't think you do," he said. She looked at him. "I grew up in this house," he said. "I know every room and every board and every place the wind gets in. I've been here my whole life, and I did not know what it felt like to come home to it until you were in it." He said it simply without dressing it up. "I just want you to know I know that." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. And this time she meant the other kind of knowing. She picked up her pen and finished the sentence she'd been writing when he came in. He sat at the table with her while she finished the page, not reading over her shoulder, just present. She made him tea because the night had gotten cold, and because that was what she did. She made things for people, and he took it with both hands the way he always did. And they sat in the kitchen of Iron Bluff in the lamplight with the wind outside doing what it always did, and the house doing what it always did, which was hold. Years later, enough years that Noah's face had changed from young to something more settled, and Dutch walked with a deliberate care that had nothing to do with consciousness of it, and Riaz had become the kind of quiet center a ranch needed, and Garrick's hair had gone almost entirely gray at the temples, in a way she found she did not mind looking at. Travelers sometimes stopped at Iron Bluff. It had a reputation by then, as places with good stock and fair dealing tended to accumulate reputations, and people came through who had heard of it and wanted to see it or do business with it. Occasionally, if they stayed for a meal, they asked how it had come to be what it was. A working ranch of that size and that stability was not an accident, and people who knew ranching knew that. They asked Garrick sometimes. They asked Dutch, who deflected with his particular economy. Once someone asked Noah, who thought about it seriously and said it was the result of people who worked hard and paid attention, which was accurate but incomplete. Once, a woman traveling through with her husband, she was maybe 60, with the look of someone who had come through some things and was not brittle about it, sat at the table for supper, and looked at the food and looked at the room and looked at Maris and said, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, this house has been cared for. Maris considered that. For a while now, she said. It shows, the woman said. You can always tell. The houses that have been loved and the ones that have just been lived in. This one has been loved. Maris set down the bread basket and looked around the dining room. Dutch at the far end with his coffee, Noah across from Reyes, Garrick at the head of the table talking about something with the woman's husband, the lamplight, the window that didn't draft, the stove door that swung right. She had arrived with 30 cents and a split seam and nowhere else to go, and an empty kitchen and a cold stove and 6 men who would need feeding before dark. She had not expected any of this. She had not planned it. She had planned only to get through the day and then the next day, and to do what was needed and not stop until it was done, because stopping was not something she had ever been built for and probably never would be. What she had learned, not all at once, not comfortably, but over time and through difficulty and through the accumulating weight of ordinary days, was that the same quality that had kept her surviving could also keep her living if she let it. That keeping a door open was not the same as refusing to come inside. That a packed bag in the corner was not the same as a packed bag under the bed. That trusting someone was not the same as handing them the power to ruin you. That what she had always done, seeing what needed doing and doing it without waiting to be asked, was not just a way to be useful. It was a way to build something. And the difference between building and surviving was that building required believing. The ground under your feet was worth building on. She had learned to believe that. It had taken her a while. She was not going to pretend it had been easy or quick, or that she hadn't stood at the foot of the stairs more than once in the first year, with her hand on the newel post and thought about the bag in the drawer and the road, and whether she was fooling herself. She wasn't fooling herself. She had checked. Multiple times. She had verified it the way she verified everything, through repeated observation and careful accounting, and what the account showed was that this place and these people were real, and they were hers, and she was theirs. That was the whole of it. That was the thing she could not have planned for and could not have found if she had been looking for it, which was the nature of most things worth having. Yes, she said to the woman across the table. It has. And she sat down and passed the bread. The bread and the supper went on around her, and outside the wind moved across the flat ground toward the mountains in the dark. And the house held, and she held, and the stove was warm, and there was enough. There was more than enough. There always had been, once she had stopped running long enough to see it.